Live. Go live. Go live. Hello, everyone. Oh, what can I say? What can I say? It's been a fun day. It's definitely been a fun day. Oh. I can also recommend certain things not to do today. Certain things that I've done today that are really not good. For starters, I seem to have given license to our long-term listener, who is listening, 96 everyone, to write up one of his dearest wishes, judging by the volume of comments from him. Yes, I am, of course, before we get into this too much, I am reiterating for anyone who hasn't realised it that the competition is live. There is a lovely video about the competition. There are all sorts of post places, but if I quickly get up the details and make sure that they are visible to you all, I will do. As you all know, the fact is, when I was thinking about what to do in terms of a competition, I spent a lot of time working out how to make it so that it would be fair to everyone. And what I came up with was something which was half history, half fiction, really. And it's an alternate history. Therefore, video. Or rather, alternate history discussion. And I hope everyone enjoys it. I hope even those who don't take part will enjoy what comes out of it. And as I said, there is prizes. There are 2 books up for grabs. And I have 3 judges who are raring to go, and 1 judge who's already got a nightmare scenario coming his way, because his actual desire is to see more than just battleships and carriers come out of this discussion. And all the discussions he's seen so far have been about battleships and carriers. And he's, going, but I was hoping there'd be something else. So, the thing is, I'm hoping there is going to be other stuff. I'm hoping there's going to be a lot of advertisement on it, because, or rather circulation, and sharing with people who might be interested in doing something for it, because it's a lot of fun as a topic goes. It's a lot of fun as most parts of naval history like that go, and it could be cool. John Sam, I've been writing all day. John Sam, I've already 4,000 words in mind, and the war has hardly started, but it's a very different war. Cool. The thing I'll be interested in is there are people who were writing to before this who were going, I won't be submitting anything, don't worry, I won't do anything, and now they're going, yeah, submitted something. Very funny, Sonic and Air. If you're noticing that I am drinking from Coca-Cola this evening rather than Iron Brew, there is a reason for that. I'm out of Iron Brew. I had to take the dogs to the vets to get them their vaccines and various things today. The lovely kennel cough vaccine. So, yeah, it was sort of a case of that was the priority today rather than me picking up Iron Brew. So, the emergency Coca-Cola was broken out from the garage because when I realised they'd run out. Actually, good evening. Is the sending one after just for a read okay? Possibly. We're going to have a discussion just about judges, about people using us as consultants. I'm tempted to suggest that if there's anyone who's happy to volunteer to act as a reader through, that would be probably better than some of the judges doing it, including myself doing it as a reader through, because that's kind of a little bit of almost sort of too much guidance there. I was edging it today with some of the advice I was giving in comments to 96831, but I enjoyed his topic, but I wanted him, and I know he's on here, to think about, what the realistic... Because one of the important things for us, and the important thing when I'm doing alternate history, which is why it's good to discuss it before I begin this video today, is the grounds for alternate history in my scenarios. I always try and keep it as close to history as possible. And actually, this is a sort of another interesting thing. When I say close to history as possible, I don't mean necessarily the events are the same, etc. But the logic has got to fit with history, with the wider events of what's going on. Because whilst you might change X, you're not going to change Z, Y, A, B, C, D, and F and the rest of the alphabet. So you've got to realise there's a lot of similar things going on. Pardon me. I'm surprised you don't have a direct pipeline to the Iron Brew Factory. If we were moving to Scotland, I might manage that. The trouble is the sheer distance down the country. Hello. Oh. No Mussolini and Japan vs Italy. Oh, that sounds fun. Well, actually, nice to go for one. I'm wondering if the British might go for... Well, they possibly still end up because of the North Sea and North Atlantic and its ability to rob aircraft with using internal hangars, which has an effect on it. Not having the sort of the hangars more internalized. There is a reason why there's such a difference in terms of hangar space and air group. There's a small difference in terms of air group space. Of hangar space between the Yorktown and the... Is it the Illustrious class? I think it was the Illustrious class. It might be an Indomitable, though. And yet there's a big, big difference in their numbers because of deck parking, etc. So that's got to be a factor you've got to think about if you're going that route. Anyway, tonight's topic is an alternate history. Helios en route. A lucky development of helicopters and appropriate tech in the 1930s. Now, there was a real criteria here that it had to be Westland Whirlwind available in 1939, equivalent to Westland Whirlwind in 1939. Now, that was difficult, frankly. I had to do a lot of working out how to make that happen. And basically, you're going to see how I've had to work it out. But the thing is, that means I've changed World War II sufficiently that I can't really say what happens in World War II. Because you've changed the core size. Nice, Aaron. My dad says the carrier the size of incomparable will be able to take up to 150 aircraft. It would be with deck parking and everything else, and especially if it had more than one hangar level. But if it's only got one hangar level and they're internalised hangars like the British build... Admittedly, they'd probably be eagle-sized hangars, which would be interesting because they'd be 20 foot high. The thing is, it's going to be less than that because they're going to be internal parking. And as I've said before, I think, as I've already told you, I think the option is the incomparable design is chosen instead of the Admiral class. That's the intriguing thing. Theoretically, then you could end up with 3 incomparable size carriers and an incomparable size battlecruiser, but that would change a lot of the treaty. But don't discuss your ideas too much here in 96841, because then you're, basically you are sharing your ideas with everyone else and that they might use for their own publications. So I don't think they would be. I don't think there's anyone really like that on here, but still, and also it's a bit of a nice surprise for us, the judges, when we're seeing these things. Hey, sorry, I meant I won't be submitting to work. Work makes it impossible. Was just wanted to send a one after deadline for amusement. Oh, fine, that's more than welcome. But also, the fact is, Verdun, there's going to be another competition later in the year, which is going to be slightly different. That's going to be more of a pure history analysis in terms of, but we're working that one out. I'm not getting into it. I'm not advising. It's your paper. Cannot write your paper for you. Will not do that. Tempting, but won't. So everyone. Yeah, I know it's in Essex, Leslie, but in the nicest way, I'm sorry. Every time one of my someone from my neck of the woods ends up in Essex, we end up with one of 5 scenarios, which range from very good to extraordinary to, oh good lord, how did that happen to you, you poor person? Hey, DeBrook, don't sit it out just because of that. Enjoy it. Right. Helios en route. A lucky development of the helicopters and appropriate tech in the 1930s. I don't know. Tribals, Battles, and Darings. The prize for the competition. There are 2 of these copies, which will come, and that's the reason why I've asked for your addresses, so I know where to send them. Your names, so I've got your accurate name to put on there, because for starters, in the nicest way, it's far better to receive your name plus your tag on YouTube, so you have both to show your family, not just your tag on YouTube as the way of addressing you. And in my experience, mums, especially when they're looking at things, like to see the name they gave you on there. Can't think why. But also, tend to be quite a few loved ones who prefer that. And then, in terms of the rest, well, it'll come with me having written a personal note to you in there. Handwritten, probably, which will be really fun, because there are some people who receive those, and I'm not sure if they've been able to read them. Paul is on this evening, so I think he's received one. He can comment as to its legibility. I did try to do my best to make it legible. So, Westland Whirlwind is the benchmark. Westland Whirlwind had its first flight on the 10th of November 1949 as the Sikorsky H-19 Chickasaw. Okay. It then goes through an anglicization and becomes the Westland Whirlwind, which had its first flight in August 1953. I think there are lots of people surprised about how successful Tribals, Battles, and Darings have been. I'm rather happy. I would like it to be more successful. Especially my tax bill would like it to be more successful. We won't get into the reason for the tax bill fund, but yeah, it's just normal sort of fun. Caramba. Running out iron brew and tax bills. Ooh, life is not good fair. General characteristics. Crew, 2 pilots. Okay. I think it's quite a big girl. Sorry, I know, again, there are people who don't like that, but let me put it this way. I'm British. We come from a history that anything that carries life is referred to as a female. So ships are female. Aircraft are female. That is the whole lexicon behind it. So, length, 41 foot, 8.5 inches. Now, yeah, they could be folded down, but that's not exactly going to be short. Height, 15 foot, 7.5 inches. I can see a problem already arising here. Empty weight, 6,000 pounds. Thank Lord the Royal Navy's carriers have their flight deck as their strength deck. Maximum takeoff weight, 7,800 pounds. I'm gonna double that, thanking Lord. A single Alvis Leonidas Major, 755, 14-cylinder, 2-row radial engine, developing 750 horsepower. Honestly, that's nothing really too much. In fact, let's consider that's a radial engine. Well, if we consider the... I don't know. Just checking. The Bristol Pegasus, that developed 690 horsepower that powered the Swordfish. So let's be honest, having a radial engine that gives off 750 horsepower, that's not much of a risk to get to, or worry to get to, especially as the Pegasus was a 9-cylinder system. That's a 14-cylinder two-row one. So it's got 7 cylinders in each row. I don't know, we've got developments going on at that time, so that's not the difficulty. Difficulty is the fact that it's 1949, 1953, so I've got to move it forward by 10 years to get it into American hands. I've got to move it forward by 14 years to get it into British hands. How am I going to do that? Oh, no, I'm not going to get into it, but basically it seems that the automatic payments for my student loans, which are supposed to come from my incomes, my income streams through various universities, plus I top it up with the money I earn from other projects myself. Not all the universities have been paying that as they were supposed to. So, yeah. We're trying to sort it out and work it out, but yeah, that's causing the fun this month before the tax bill comes in. It's no one's. There are technicalities of exactly how much I earn, as such that some unis consider it that you're supposed to opt in, and I had opted in, but it apparently hadn't registered that I'd opted in, and yeah, that's all off the topic. Anyway. It just consumed about a large chunk of my day today. Other than taking the dogs to the vet. It just, yeah. Maximum speed, 109 miles per hour. Okay. Range, 334 miles. That's 290 nautical miles, so that's not massive, but not bad. Surface ceiling, 13,000 foot. Not bad. Rate of climb, 910 foot. Armed with a Mark 30 or Mark 44 torpedo or depth charges. So honestly, we could arm them with depth charges quite a lot earlier than that. And anti-submarine bombs, I suppose. Rockets, definitely. Probably could work out how to fit rockets onto that thing. Honestly, I would leave a chief petty officer and some fitters alone for about 45 minutes. They'll probably figure out how to mount the rockets. Yeah. It's doable. Dipping sonar, well, they actually have a version of a dipping Aztec which they were working on for a trawler, or rather, it wasn't really that great in 1939. There's a reason it's not available for aircraft till after World War II. But the fact is, there is the concept there. So the concepts and ideas are there. What we need is the money behind them, and we need the interest in them. H.G. Wells could solve the issue of 14 years very quickly. The trouble is, I'm a historian, not a fiction writer, and this is alternate history, what we can learn from by paths not travelled. So I have to figure this one out. Well, the problem for me is Westland Whirlwind is not first generation. It's not even second, really. It's realistically third. Some people sometimes try and claim fourth generation of helicopter. So this is one of the reasons why we have to change quite a lot of history. And the history I'm going to change is quite simple. It actually becomes very simple once you think about it. So I have to go back to 1923. I have to go to George the Buzzard, and I have to change his first flight location from the middle of, I think it's Oklahoma, isn't it? McCook Field? I could be wrong. It might not be Oklahoma. I know it's one of the states in the center of America, but I think I could be wrong with Oklahoma. I think it's too north for Oklahoma. Where is the George? Where is the McCook Field? It's right in the center of America, though. And I'm going to change it for the US under the US Army Air Service to Chambers Field and to US Naval Aviation. So basically, this guy goes and is the first person to really fly a helicopter. He manages it for a little over 2 minutes. He manages it a little over 2 minutes. It's airborne. It's actually technically a quadcopter. That's always the thing that amazes most people. It's a quadcopter. It's not a helicopter as we would think about it. It's 4. Mainly because the difficulty of trying to make the blades the size they did. But actually they quickly solved that issue. So once you start working out with aluminium, you can solve that issue quite quickly. But they do start on this scenario. So I have changed this. Why is that the only change I need to make? Why do I need to change to bring about helicopters so much earlier? Why don't I have to change a lot more? Well, here's the thing. The Army Air Service were bitten by the same bug, realistically, as the Air Ministry in the 1930s. And as Dan Freeman says, quadcopter also negates the torque issues and various other issues to deal with the testing it. And the thing is, the Army Air Service gets the same bug, i.e. bomber, 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 bomber. We must devote aid to the bombers. Now, I have sort of lied though when I said I only need to make one change, because I've moved it to the Navy. I need to also change this man, just one tad. Okay? William A. Moffett, the leader of the Bureau of Aeronautics from 1921 to 1933, when he dies in a crash of the largest dirigible in the world, the USS Akron. This man is the equivalent of Henderson. He is an absolutely amazing politician and organizer of the US Navy. I have no doubt if he had lived, he would have been chief naval officer at some point. There is a very real chance that would have been him rather than King in charge of the US Navy during World War II. A very real chance. It's unlikely, because he'd probably been a bit old by that point. But it's not impossible. Now, the clue to what I'm going to change about him is what kills him. He gets absolutely obsessed with airships. He's really obsessed with them. He believes they are a core capability for the future of naval aviation. And whilst I can accept that to an extent, it kills him. But also, the thing is, he picks up this obsession realistically, in terms of getting it, really pushing it forward, about 1923. So, if instead George de Beaufort is demonstrating in front of Moffett in 1923, I'm going to say the obsession he gets is for helicopters. Now, two things happen therefore. One, he's unlikely to die in the largest dirigible in the world crashing. Because he's unlikely to die in the largest dirigible in the world crashing, because they're unlikely to have quite so many dirigibles. But there are other things we are likely to get. Because if he is pushing it, what does he want helicopters for the US Navy? Well, anti-submarine warfare is going to be part of it, spotting is going to be part of it, but reconnaissance is going to be part of it. And remember the idea about using them as troop carriers? Well, think about this. There are certain ships he's really keen on the idea of that actually with helicopters and being able to land and provide anti-submarine warfare, security over a wide area, etc., they can make a lot of sense. There are lots of things Moffat is keen on that could work with helicopters. And if he's putting his very, very capable political organizational will behind it, and remember, this is a man who gets Congress to actually pay for things. The reason the US Navy and the US Naval Aviation is in the seat it is in the 1930s and in World War II is largely due to the fact that this was one of the few men in the world who knew how to make the US Congress actually pay for stuff which they didn't want to pay for. I am not sure what his secret was. I have tried to study him. I have tried to learn that, because that is a skill. A man who can make the US Congress cough open their wallets and pay for something is someone who is worthy being studied. A lot. And honestly, he's kind of like Henderson. You don't know how he does it. At certain points, he's doing absolute bald-faced lies to them. In that there is only very, very specific perspectives which can state that what he is saying is actually the truth. But he gets away with it. And he gets to fund him. And the only thing we can be thankful for the US ability to actually not spend money on defense is that he never linked up with Tillman. Tillman was never alive to link up with him in the times they could have crossed over. Because goodness knows what the US Navy would have had. Honestly, there is... The entire Lexington class would have been aircraft carriers for starters. There would have been 6 of them. They'd all been aircraft carriers. There are so many options for what this guy was doing to try and get people to do what he wanted to do in the 20s and 30s. He seems to be very, very effective at it. To the extent that I would suggest that when the USS Akron went down, there was quite a heavy investigation into it. Because it was helium-filled. It was a flying aircraft carrier carrying F-9C Sparrowhawk fighter planes. And she's destroyed in a thunderstorm off the coast of New Jersey. In April 1933. It's a really interesting... If you want to look up a really interesting thing to consider, the USS Akron is probably it. And I have considered whether she would be key aircraft or key ships. I think she's probably key aircraft. And she might be in Series 2 of key aircraft. Henderson and Moffat working together is not something good for the world. Those two would have too much capability. The world would lose something. Or gain a lot of things. We'd probably have a working space navy and colonies on Pluto by now if those two had worked together. So, he is an interesting gentleman. He is an interesting gentleman. And so, here is my scenario. We have a cruiser competition in the 1920s and the 1930s, where they can't build battleships, so they build cruisers. Well, there's also a bit of a tech competition going on in 20s and 30s. You might not realize it. It's not something you talk about a lot, but there is a bit of a tech competition going on. And in the, it's usually focused on airships and other interesting things. But what happens if it's focused on helicopters? What happens if Moffat is obsessed with helicopters? Then the Royal Navy's going to have to respond, because they can't let, the Americans get too far ahead on helicopters without the Royal Navy getting involved. And it could be something really interesting, because if the Royal Navy is funding helicopters and putting forward helicopters for naval duties, do the RAF get involved? Do the Air Ministry get involved? Or do they leave this to the Royal Navy? Think about that. Could the Royal Navy end up with going, well, helicopters, they're the rebirth of the Fleet Air Arm? Which could be really, really interesting. There's a whole sort of thing, because the Air Ministry still wouldn't want to get involved. Because they're really not interested in this sort of stuff. It's off the route of march for them. But for the Navy, it's core competency. But then, have we had a Fenderson as first Sea Lord patron yet? Nope. And this is really the generation they start being viable for, well, when we call them viable, that's so saying. When they start being utilized and actually start being considered. And you see these in various movies, if you look at certain ones from certain periods. The Dragonfly. Now, the Dragonfly versus the or the H5, what do you want to call it? How do I put this politely? The H5 has a 450 9-cylinder air-cooled radial piston engine, 450 horsepower. A Pratt & Whitney 985 Wasp Junior. The Dragonfly has an Albus Leonardis 9. By the way, an Albus Leonardis engine is first developed in 1936. So, saying they could be around for 1939, yeah. 9-cylinder air-cooled radial piston engine with 520 horsepower. I kid you not, their useful load is like 1 crew and 3 passengers. They're not really much for anything, but they're good testing points. They look good, and they start to sound good, and they like to sound like they're sort of... They are for rescue, communications, they're for all sorts of things. Again, for the Royal Navy, this would actually be liked. There's a reason why the Royal Navy would like this actually almost more than the Americans, because you consider that the Royal Navy has various ranks of admirals. The Americans, they all stop at Rear Admiral, and then they give them sort of semi-permanent promotions above that. Because that's the way the US Navy works in this period. It's all sorts of fun, their command structure. And, well, you need to get admirals from point to point with a couple of staff officers to go and have discussions with other admirals. This'll do it. You want to scare the bejesus out of, I don't know, a Japanese admiral. Well, if they don't realize you have a helicopter, your helicopter turns up, drops off the admiral and a couple of staff officers. Hello, we're here to have a meeting about the fact you've taken the SS Vincent de Paul. Our crews will be joining us in a couple of hours. We thought we'd come ahead to start the conversation first. You did? Now, the Japanese would of course get involved in this, and I wouldn't be surprised if everyone gets involved in this, but we'll talk about that one later. There's a Canadian in the 1930s that tried to develop a coaxial helicopter, but was stopped by the government as they didn't have any regulation that allowed helicopters. Yeah, I was trying to look for some one-off person to actually succeed, but in the end I had to come back to they need funding and they need competition. They need a reason for this. So, this is really the second generation of helicopters. The first generation is really military viable as a helicopter. And we have to consider mothers offered the idea. And this is the first thing that's going to come in which is going to cause the Royal Navy real worry. Because, let's take this, okay, this idea. Let's make it slightly more sensible. You no longer have to do a full-length flight deck because you don't need a full-length flight deck to operate helicopters, do you? And the big problem with this is it makes it so big, so massive. What you can do is an X, Y, an A, B, and X and Y scenario. You can get rid of X, and you can raise up this, and you can have some form of normal structure forward with 2 turrets, and you could have 9 6-inch guns, and you could have a very large hangar operating helicopters, couldn't you? And that's slightly more viable. That suddenly becomes very interesting, thank you very much. That's something which can do anti-submarine warfare for a task group, and for cruisers. We know the US Navy needs it, especially once they have top-dipping sonar, and there are, as I said, there are various ideas being developed along that route, and there's already... Most of the dipping sonars in this period being sort of developed are being looked at are acoustic research systems. Oceanic acoustic research systems, from what I can see of what I looked at. But it's a possibility of developing them. There's stuff there, which I know goes on to become a sort of platform that's later developed upon. But the thing is, there's stuff there. So, you know, if you've got, as we often say, necessity is the mother of invention. And if you suddenly have the potential for the capability, so you will need to create the capability, you will find the stuff and develop it. Now, yes, you could try and go for a sloop with helicopters on the back, but the trouble is that's not really the American way. The British might do that. The British might be very interested in a 2,000-ton sloop designed with a helicopter landing pad. They could be very interested in that. We'll talk about that in a second. But the thing is, for the Americans, this suddenly makes this idea very practical. And you could soon work this around to being almost an area control ship with the helicopters. No, it doesn't have fighters, it doesn't have long-range air defense, but the helicopters can provide anti-submarine warfare, they can provide some reconnaissance, some search, and they can provide ability to land some troops and move them around fields and help with development work in areas. And so it becomes a useful asset. And it can move forces around your fleet. It can move personnel around your fleet. The helicopters can move people from one ship to another ship. Because it's far easier to build a landing platform or a landing spot on a ship than it is to build a hangar and a facility to support an aircraft. Yes, you can add flight decks to freighters, etc. But if you're pre the London Treaty and you're wanting to make the case for this for your navy, that's sort of what you go. You go down the route of this. You go down the route of 9 6-inch guns and a whole lot of flight deck space for helicopters. And again, I could see this being an interesting scenario because it could lead to there being a category of a light cruiser, heavy cruiser, and aviation cruiser. Imagine that. Category of aviation cruiser. Now, 10,000 tons, how many of these are allowed? I don't know. What's really funny is if the British are building sloops, not building this because they're concentrating on building the counties because they don't think it's worthwhile to divert the funds off. Moffat has won the political battle and got some of these built with his lovely helicopters, which he's got developed. And suddenly the London Naval Treaty comes through, and that, of course, iterates cruisers, but divides them up into light and heavy. Well, it could suddenly have a third category of aviation cruiser. And suddenly the Royal Navy and the IGN will be going, you know what? Now you've given us the tonnage, let's see, what do we want? Thank you very much. Or maybe the tonnage gets turned into something else. Maybe the tonnage gets turned into aircraft carriers in the Royal Navy's case. Or, you know, like the Royal Navy does with their heavy cruiser to light cruiser tonnage. There's all sorts of options. The more variables you factor into any treaty, the more you lead to customizations. So, this is something. Did the RN go to helicopter cruiser route? Well, that's an interesting thing. The RN going to helicopter cruiser route Well, they do traditionally, and they do historically, but that's post-World War II. What have they done pre-World War II? Well, so far people have been talking about 2,000 ton sloops. And if we consider, let's say, the Black Swan class, they displace 1,250 tons. Standard displacement, 1,250 tons in their original form. They are armed with 6 4-inch guns in 3 twin mounts. It's not impossible to see how you can modify that design, that hull, make it a little bit longer, and include a helicopter. It's not impossible to see. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is the hangar height. Because, think about it, you're going to need space to maintain those aircraft. You need quite a big hangar. So that's the only fly in the ointment sort of thing of the idea of the sloop class, sloop sort of level vessels being used. But again, it's not impossible. What you could end up seeing is something like a modern frigate, even a modern Type 23, etc., or the Type 22s, where you have the guns forward, and the guns aft might be mounted above the hangar. They might well have that step down as they do traditionally, and have the hangar below that. But there again, if they do that, then the depth charges, etc., things which they normally have on that position, are going to be on the flight deck, and that won't work. So you've got to actually put in a structure over them for a flight deck aft. So you probably won't have that. You probably will end up having them which at least look like they have a continuous deck the whole way along, when actually they really don't. It would be intriguing to see how the British would approach this. It's going to probably be complicated, but it's not impossible. Would they put helipads on Warspite instead of a catapult? Well, that's an interesting thing. That's another thing to think about. If the British are going for helicopters in the 1930s and doing that on seaplanes, then consider Supermarine, who depend upon selling amphibians to the Royal Navy. Supermarine might well be one of the companies which has switched over to supplying helicopters and doing the work on helicopters to keep funding coming in. Because let's be honest, if the Royal Navy aren't buying the flying boats, the seaplanes from Supermarine, then Supermarine are going bankrupt. The Air Ministry do not give them enough orders. They just don't. Held a sneeze. Sorry, didn't want to sneeze all over you. Convoy Commodore on a freighter with a few helicopters and much super survival protection. Again, that's a scenario. If you've got helicopters, you can put them into service for anti-submarine warfare a lot earlier. Now, the difference is, and please take note of this, of course, that U-boats actually hang around on the surface. Modern submarines hide under the water, and that's how they try and hide things, which means a helicopter can hover and also things to track down. But U-boats tend to sit on the surface quite a lot. So they will might well try and engage with their guns, and the helicopter is slower moving. So this is one of the reasons why I think rockets will come in for a lot more quickly for anti-submarine duties, because it gives the helicopter almost standoff range to engage the submarines. Now, 300-mile range, would that be good enough to hunt subs? That's an interesting choice, a question, but yes. Let me explain. You don't need to go... A helicopter's role in convoys or anti-submarine is not to go out hunting. They're not going out into the Central Atlantic to go, we're going to find the submarines. Their reason is to patrol the area around. So as long as you can keep the submarines out of torpedo range of your convoy, you're fine. 300 miles is more than enough for that. You know, you can go out 20 miles and orbit around the convoy and do a couple of circuits around and then come back. That's what you probably would be sort of doing, keeping an eye out and watching. And the other advantage is, again, you're going to force the submarines to dive, because the submarines either try and engage you, which if they engage you, A, they may hit you, they may not. B, they're going to attract you and the attention of your friends as well as you, because there'll be other helicopters coming along. They're going to respond a lot quicker than any escort can be, and probably an escort's going to start tracking in your direction as well, if you're a submarine engaging a helicopter. And B, and this is the other issue you've got, if you try and dive to avoid them, that means you're going to be diving a long way away from the convoy, and so you're probably going to lose them, because your attacks on convoys depend on you being able to see them. Through the periscope, or actually from your surface bridge, where you're looking out with binoculars, so you can spot them, track them, and position yourself to deal with them. Because, again, submarines below the water are slow. It can't even keep up with a convoy. Even a slow convoy can outpace a submarine, which is underwater. So, for that matter, the helicopters, to an extent, killing the enemy isn't nearly required. What they require to do is to stick the enemy under the water. A submerged submarine in World War II, especially if it's submerged early enough, far enough away from the convoy, is not a threat. It's a neutralized. I think that will be their focus. That will be their focus. Hey Dawson, we already have carriers. Well, this is the interesting thing. You see, I had an interesting thing of looking at Argus versus USS Langley as testbeds, and I thought they would probably be the testbeds, but there was something which immediately went through my mind. You see, the H5, that's 13 foot high. That fits in an Argus. You can maintain that in an Argus. It's 16 foot, its hangar space. Height of 16 foot. Which is not small, but it's just not big enough either. And Langley, of course, ends up being converted into a seaplane carrier, as you can see here. I'm not sure what she did to really upset the US Navy Command, but I think it must have been something fairly heinous to have that done to her. But she is a converted collier in the first place, so you could say she's going back to her roots. She's, of course, sunk in 1942. The point about these ships is that they are around to do testing on. And test the concept of a small carrier, a helicopter carrier, and can test what it can do. And that's what they'd be used for. That is what they'd be used for. They'd be wandering around. Argus would be testing everything. Argus would be very much involved in everything. But, again, there are some realities you have to consider with all these ships. If the US Navy and the Royal Navy get too attached to the idea of using them as helicopter carriers and start using them, that's going to cause ripples in things. The more useful the helicopter is, and considering how quickly helicopters developed, again, it's considering how quickly they developed. You know, the H5, which I showed you earlier, you know, that first flight is 1943. August 1943. This aircraft. The British had flew it in 1948. This first flew 49 in the case of the Chickasaw. Chickasaw 50 in 1953 in the case of the Westland Whirlwind. There's a rapid development going on here. An absolutely rapid development, because this is 48 for the Royal Navy and the Whirlwind is 53. This is 43 for the US Navy. The Whirlwind, well, rather what they call it, the Chickasaw, is 49. World War II, it does take up a lot of room. It takes up a lot of design time, but those ships, those aircraft, were ready very quickly. So there's a lot of capabilities already around, is my view. And so things become interesting. Considering helicopters grow as quickly, if not quicker in size than their counterpart aircraft, and looking at the various viabilities for them, it's quite possible that they can be retrofitted and activated. It's also quite possible we get massive changes in historical times of development, because if these helicopters are being developed, they're going to be used for things. That's the other thing you have to imagine. One of the points I often have to make to people is that technological development is not a straight line. It's not linear. It's like that. So the more effort you're putting into it, the more quickly it starts to do that, because things start to build upon each other. So the more you use helicopters in the 1920s and early 30s, the more you're going to develop them. The more ideas you're going to have about them. More capabilities that are going to appear. There's a lot of thinking in terms of seaplane carriers are not included in the treaty limits. They're differentiated off. The same might be true for helicopter carriers. But again, what are they warships? What are they doing? Are they auxiliaries? Are they... all sorts of things that come into place. You have to be very careful to keep a seaplane carrier an auxiliary rather than a warship. Or usually it tends to get counted against your cruiser tonnage numbers. I think I'm going to... Coke. I was going to burp and then I made a weird noise instead. I have no idea why. I hope I managed to turn it off in that time. Apologies. There is a lot of fun with the limbo in the Leander frigates and various other things, yes. There's a lot of interesting options. Thank you, Avis. R.I.P. Yeah, I'm not quite that bad yet. I am on Coke rather than Iron Brew. It's just not the same. Not the same. Oh. Anyway. So let's start considering the impact for World War II. And one of the things I'm going to admit here and now is I'm actually not going to get too much into World War II itself. Mainly because World War II is going to be incredibly different. Let me start off by saying that there are a few things which change World War II as much as the occurrence of helicopters earlier on this timeline. we're going to be talking about all the various scenarios they have factored, but let's start off with the first one. Affects World War II, it's not just convoys, it's patrols of scalper flow and other bases. We've already talked about sufficiently, BlackburnMaximus have already mentioned, sufficiently armed helicopters could be dangerous enough against Schnellboots and dog boats, depending on the side of the war, yeah. Small boats. Think about all those attacks that managed to make it into World War II. Now, add in the Royal Navy's penchant for night flying and night aviation. The whole scenario for, attacking Scalper Flow. Well, if you've got helicopters patrolling around there, that's going to be very interesting. Think about the Mediterranean, where the water is pretty much see-through. Submarines already had a tough enough time dealing with shallow waters in the Mediterranean. In a world where there are helicopters literally having a go-slow regular patrol, that's going to massacre them. So, honestly, things change very quickly. You can secure Scalper Flow with a squadron of helicopters flying around it supporting a patrol ship. What happens if you have been the British? The British have gone down the route of fitting them to sloops, designing sloops to take 3 or 4 of these helicopters, and building a 2,000, probably it's about an 1,800-ton sloop vessel with them. Let's say they've just been building 3 or 4 of those a year. Well, they're going to have 20 plus more ships. Even they started in 1935. They started in 1928, and they're building 4 of those a year, alongside the other things which they're building, which they probably would be. Because let's be honest, sloops are not a big, high-expense item for the Royal Navy. They're actually quite useful because they keep the rest of the prices down by giving yards work. And the Royal Navy understands it at that time. So, you could be talking the Royal Navy could have 40 plus of them in service by the time World War II springs around, if it happens on original timeline in 1939. Think about that. Where those are going to be positioned around the world. Think about the impact they have on convoys, but also think about the impact they have on just if they just sit in a harbour and have searching around. The Graf Spee. All sorts of vessels around. Because the thing is, when you're on one of those sloops, or if you're in a cruiser which has helicopters, and it's patrolling for surface raiders or submarines, think about it from the perspective of the cruiser captain. You no longer have to have that debate, well, hang on, if I launch a seaplane, I then have to recover it, which means I have to stop. The Royal Navy officers hate stopping. Why? Because of Abaca, Cressy and Hogue. They hate stopping. They love to zigzag. They hate stopping. They even think in a zigzag. They don't even think in straight lines anymore. They think constantly in a zigzag. That's the Royal Navy officer in World War II. Well, they don't have to stop. They can launch their helicopter, recover their helicopter, launch their helicopter, recover their helicopter, and they never have to stop the ship. That changes things. That changes the whole concept of air search. That changes the value of the aircraft. Suddenly, the aircraft go from something they want to get rid of the moment war begins because they're not using it, to something which is absolutely vital. So the fact is, you could have a very different scenario going on in World War II very quickly. I mean, we've already, again, BlackburnMaximus, you've mentioned Italians with helicopters in the med will be very dangerous for Royal Navy subs, especially T-class. Yes, but think about it from the other perspective. Think about helicopters operating from Gibraltar. Think about Italian and German submarines trying to get in or trying to get out of the Mediterranean. If you've got a couple of squadrons of helicopters operating from Gibraltar, are any submarines getting through? Or rather, of how many submarines are you going to have to send to try and get them through? It's going to be a lot. And this scenario doesn't stop there. Because the helicopters can be used for a lot of different operations. They can be used for a lot of different positions, a lot of different discussions. If the Royal Navy was aiming, and I mean this, if the Royal Navy is aiming for it with helicopters, they could be getting a very distinct capability. Now, what's another thing that's going to do? Well, this could well change some of the scenarios for World War II in terms of aircraft to stick around. Because suddenly, whilst Swordfish might be good for long range, it will probably become long-range aviation patrol and air patrol. And still probably use them for that, because let's be honest, the range of a Swordfish versus a helicopter, the Swordfish is going to be able to range out far further. And able to do the anti-ship work, theoretically. But you're going to get a far more comprehensive defense. But you're also going to get a shift in tactics from things, because I can see small boats being less of a factor. With cannon, with rockets, with depth charges, let's be honest, small boats versus helicopters is not going to be fun for them. And you can also do things like, well, I would say you have to be quite careful with the idea of doing merchant ship inspections by dropping Marines or sailors aboard, or doing anti-shipping operations in terms of helicopters, because those, you know, trouble is for a helicopter is it's going to be able to be eaten by anti-ship gunnery, anti-aircraft AA gunnery. Most of the AA gunnery is going to be able to deal with a helicopter. In terms of range, it's going to be effective. In terms of what a warship would carry. As for merchant vessels, yes, you can theoretically do that, but how many people can you really land by a single helicopter at this point? And how many can you really do that with? It becomes interesting very quickly. It becomes interesting very quickly, is what I'm going to say. But it's doable. You also have to deal with the factor that if you've got helicopters for reliability and viability of the Westland Whirlwind, you have also got limitations in terms of weather. Those limitations are probably going to apply to others in terms of them operating, but there are, you know, certainly weather scenarios where they're not going to be viable. So you can't afford to be totally reliant on them. But again, pilot rescue from ships and shore, yeah, you can use the helicopter. You don't need to send boats. You don't need to drive a destroyer into a minefield. You can send a helicopter. Oh, and you want to survey a minefield? You can send a helicopter if it's within range. There are a lot of options you can do. If you consider the US Marine Corps is famous for doing this, but how they use helicopters. I think the US Navy uses them, but I think it's US Navy, but also the US Marine Corps. The US Navy certainly does for the sea ones, I think. Use helicopters for their mine hunting. Those systems are excellent systems. But they're also not the most advanced bits of technology. They're not really something which you can't fundamentally develop in this period if you're motivated enough. And let's be honest, war is a major motivation factor. I mean, a world war can be incredibly invigorating when it comes to, you know, we have an idea we're thinking about. Well, let's not get on with it. How much of that idea has worked out? It'll work. It's simple. Do it now. That's the difference of war. And yes, Kalmagasberg, we've already done the HMS Sydney event, so I'm not going to get into that. But basically, the aircraft didn't seem to work, so that's why they were getting so close. The thing is, again, if you're talking about it though at that period, they're carrying one seaplane, and they got the space to launch it. If you have helicopters starting in the 1920s, the odds of any of the light cruisers not being launched with the ability to carry at least two, if not more of them. Because again, one of the factors that goes through everyone's heads in using seaplanes is that you have to recover them. So if helicopters, with them being able to recover while they're moving, that's a no-brainer. You carry more of them and you can do it. So again, there are things like Sydney might not be lost to the Cormorant. And Nyoka 472 is right though. There are derricks and masts, and getting too close to a helicopter very risky. But a helicopter, the thing is, the helicopter could wander around the Cormorant close enough to spot anything that's a problem and a threat, but far enough away, it's not going to get hit by derricks if it was a normal merchant ship. And if the Cormorant fires on it, then it loses its ability to surprise the Sydney. These are all options. And I've been trying to sustain myself in not getting to the big change. That's really sort of intriguing to me as a naval aviation historian and in terms of my PhD thesis. But the patrols from Scapa Flow, other bases, it changes things. Do you get in to destroy the Royal Oak in Scapa Flow if there are helicopters patrolling around? I don't know. I would think it's made incredibly more difficult. Incredibly more difficult. Excellent. A helicopter rockets is going to be very useful not having a mid-Atlantic gap, though. I'm using the U-boats might fight the helicopter, but they can't direct in a follow-up bomber. And they can direct in a follow-up bomber. And honestly, let's please, the point I would make about the helicopters again is you'd be carrying enough that they would, they A, could fire rockets, and B, the odds are you wouldn't just be dealing with one of them. That's the thing. If you think about it, if you've got a sloop with three of them aboard, 3 or 4, and you've got a couple of sloops like that in the convoy, okay, that's 8. You probably would have an escort carrier or some kind, which might well have another 8 aboard. And again, that can be very quickly made to operate them, and that's probably a converted freighter carrying helicopters from the get-go, or something similar. So that means you could have 16 in a convoy. So at any point, you could quite easily maintain 4 airborne wandering around and 4 on alert across the 3 ships. So you engage one. Yay, I'm engaging one. There are 4 taking off on their way to you. There's another one of the airborne ones on its way to you. The other 2 which are airborne are making sure none of your buddies are coming in from other directions. Yay, I'm engaging one. I'm going to win this fight. Oh, frigate, there's 5 more. I can win the fight 1v1 with any of them. Can I win the fight versus 6 and not get damaged to the point at which I cannot dive? Damage to the point at which I can't get home. Damage to the point at which I sink. That's the reality when you're dealing with helicopters in this scenario. That's always been the reality of dealing with helicopters. The advantage of helicopters in an anti-submarine warfare scenario is their speed and maneuverability. It's not their range, it's not their, payload, anything like that. It's the fact that they can quickly redeploy, and suddenly you're not dealing with 1 hunting you, you're dealing with 4 hunting you. And that's a real problem. A real problem. And, yeah. The thing, as I've already mentioned, and I will talk about this again, if the U-boats take the option of diving, once they're submerged, they can't catch up with the convoy. They're as good as dead. So the choice is fight with the helicopter or dive. And this is before we get to the whole thing of air search radar. Air search radar. If you consider air search radar being added onto helicopters hunting submarines, oh frigate, those poor subs. I'm almost feeling sorry for the U-boat commanders right now, considering their level of tech. Actually, they just aren't fast enough in World War II unless you develop the gas turbine. Let's consider that. Let's consider that. The Whirlwind does not have a gas turbine. The Whirlwind is capable of, and this is the benchmark we're looking for in 1939, of 95 knots. Now, yes, that's not fast, Verdun. I agree that's not fast, but compared to the movement speed of a submarine, it can do 109 miles an hour. Okay? Let's say you are 10 miles from the convoy. You're no real risk to the convoy at that point. You're far away, but they can cross that distance if they're going at full speed in a little under 6 minutes. If you are 5 miles or 3 miles from the convoy, you could be getting met with them very quickly. Swordfish. Their top speed was 124 knots. They're not exactly fast, but they're some of the best sub-killers and ship killers in the world during World War II. Doesn't matter how fast you are in terms of aircraft. They're never going to win. The Whirlwind's never going to win an argument with a fighter in terms of speed. They just don't faster than the submarine. Oh, and third on, I meant the subs aren't fast enough. I don't even think gas turbines would make them faster, honestly. The submarines just would be having a problem, which is going to change the convoy war. Think about it. One of the problems for the German surface fleet is they're not seen as successful as a submarine fleet. Without the happy time in 1941, where they get both a large number of submarines out on the water, and the Royal Navy is reaching a real problem because of some of the decisions taken in 1939 to redirect its funding. But if they don't get that happy time, if they lose more submarines in 1939, 1940, which means they have less experienced crews to break up, to create the crews and form the nucleus of the crews in 1941. If all that happens and submarines are less effective, does Hitler withdraw funding from the Kriegsmarine in 1942? Does he withdraw it in 1941? Think about it. If he loses Bismarck, the submarines aren't getting the hits he needs to be getting to the convoy war. Does he cut his losses? He does the unthinkable, according to our standards anyway, by basically cancelling his surface fleet. Would he cancel his submarine fleet as well? Would he cancel his whole fleet? That's an honest scenario to think about. This is one of the reasons why I haven't got too far into. I haven't gone into World War II. I'm going to talk about all the things that have changed, but I'm not going to talk about World War II itself because the helicopters and the necessary criteria for those helicopters to exist, the tech race between Britain and America, which I'm sure Japan would also be part of. will make such a difference in terms of the circumstance of World War II that it makes it beyond our capability to really compute without a lot of computing power and me spending a lot of time with a very, very big computer. And then let's get into this. Changes in design. Now, I'm going to read this bit out and then I'm going to start discussing, but I want to read this out, so I'm going to expand it all for you. Hopefully I won't have another weird... I'm not sure what that was earlier. It's not specialist cruisers or even sloops. Carriers will have to change. The Westland Whirlwind and most contemporary helicopters are greater than 15 foot high. Especially in the case of Westland Whirlwind, it's 15 foot 7.5 inches. To really work with them, you need space. To maintain them, you need space. So hangar heights will have to be higher. Illustrious class was built at 16 foot. Arc rolls were only slightly better. Even your quants, the maintenance carrier's hangar was only 16 foot 6 inch. The USN, which had higher clearance, is still not good, with a height of 20 foot in Lexington's, but only 17 foot 3 inches in the Yorktowns and 70 foot 6 inches in the Essexes. Likely minimum height ends up about 18 foot. There's a reason for that. Honestly, you want at least 2 foot of clear space to be able to winch up that rotor. Look at that Westland, look at that Whirlwind. Look at those helicopters and think about winching them up. Think about maintaining them. Now, those are... I think those are Wessexes. Yes, they're Wessexes. In that picture, judging by the things, but still, it's the same issue. Wessexes, if I'm not mistaken, were even higher. They were 15 foot 10 inches. So they're not a bad proximity here. And if you want to lift that rotor up for maintenance, which you have to do, you have to take the whole rotor off occasionally, you want space to maneuver it. Honestly, just like the USN was able to stop Buer's demands for a flush deck carrier, thanks to the information made available through the US Naval Attaché in the UK, Mr. J.C. Hanasaka seemed to have some very good friends in the Royal Navy who basically went, oh, they're talking about flush deck carrier. Here's all the information you need, mate. And more. Oh, frigate. No, we don't want this. The British probably hear about this from USN, although to be fair, the British, after realising only Eagle 20 foot 6 inches could really operate the helicopter successfully, might well have twigged themselves. So the thing is, this is going to cause a change, which has a knock-on effect for World War II and aviation and all sorts of things afterwards, in that the British are going to have to build their hangars higher. That becomes a problem, okay? So, you have two options in that scenario. You build them slightly deeper into your carrier, and building them 15 foot gave them roughly 7 foot for each deck alongside them. So the other option is to sort of build them slightly bigger than that, even an 18 foot, and go full, well, Royal Navy going for 20 foot carriers like they hangars like they have on Eagle. But the reality is, the British will probably have to start thinking through their carrier design, as will the Americans. They'll have to think it through. They'll have to work out, is it big enough for operating helicopters? What does this change? Well, you very quickly are going to need more space. You're going to need more space, full stop. So for the Royal Navy, they're in a real pickle with the Washington Naval Treaty, with the London Naval Treaty. And they're in a real pickle when it comes to aircraft carrier design, because they haven't got Lexingtons. They've got Eagle. And that's a real clue, by the way, I would say, that Eagle, if we consider when Eagle's built, they consider the Americans at the height of their ones. If you consider the heights that's adopted for Hermes, etc., all these things, when you're talking about fleet carriers in that sort of period, you're talking about a 20-foot hangar for some reason. Hermes, of course, is built as, to an extent, a scout cruiser, a cruiser carrier. More than a fleet carrier, and so she's given the 16-foot hangar. With all that's going on, these ships are going to have to be designed from the get-go to have this. That's going to change all of them. Literally every single design. If you turn around to the Royal Navy and tell them that they're going to have to make their 16-foot hangars 18-foot high, and that's the bare minimum you can get away with. As I said, I reckon should be sensibly 20 feet, but they can probably get away with 18 foot. They can probably get away with 18 foot. They're going to have to think things through carefully. They really are. What do they do with that? Well, the weight's going to have to come from somewhere. Either the carriers are going to have to be bigger, or they're going to have to be longer. And I think they're probably, to balance it, going to have to be longer. Because I think what they have to do to sort of take the weight down, to balance it out and keep the stability, so they don't go higher, because they're already getting on the height of stability issues. I think they have to build them longer so they can move more stuff down into the hull, so they have more space in the hull, and then they have the hangar. Now that's going to cause some interesting debates, which might actually lead to, for example, for the British, this actually might lead to the sort of higher pressure 600 psi sort of level steam plants actually being adopted, because they might be the only ones which can provide enough power on suitable levels of weight to get them in at the tonnage requirements to actually produce the speed needed for the carrier to operate. If that's the case, then that can change all sorts of things. That could change the design for probably the Crown colonies. Doubtful it's the Town class, but maybe the Crown colonies, and maybe even for the King George V's, if they're already going down that route for the carriers. The thing is, it might even affect Ark Royal. And if it affects Ark Royal, then that could affect the entire Town class and all the British light cruisers forward from the Town class. And it could affect British destroyers as well. So we have to think through. This requirement is going to be a major thing. It's going to have an impact. Ark Royal has 2 hangars. They're both a little over 16 foot in practicality. If they're a little over 18 foot in practicality, that's going to add 4 foot onto the height of that ship. Ark Royal is already a frigating tall vessel. British carriers are not short. They're tall. They're stable, but they're tall, they're pushing it, and the British know they're pushing it. I doubt the Brits quit the treaty. I doubt the Americans quit the treaty. The Brits might not be pushing for a reduction in tonnage, though. They might actually manage to get their politicians on the side for an increase in aircraft carrier tonnage. It might be one of the things that goes up. I think you'd also have the factor that one of the things that's going to filter into this is going to be the size of the hangars used on the cruisers and the sloops.
if they're 20-foot hangars, and I have sincere beliefs they could end up being 20-foot hangars on them, so they can do all their maintenance inside the hangar for the helicopters, then that sets the precedence for the carriers. If they're 18 foot, they might get away with 18 foot. But, you know, it's going to be interesting. And again, BlackburnMaximus, F3 style carrier, F3 style cruiser, possibly. F3 style King George V. For those who don't know, the F3 is a design which was looked at alongside the Nelson Nelrods, which was the battlecruiser variant. So far, I haven't heard anyone doing that as a topic for the video, for a topic for the competition. But we'll see. I'll see what people produce in with it. But the thing is, that actually becomes more of a likelihood, because let's think about this from the perspective of even for the King George V's. Because what's the best place to operate the helicopters from? Having them come in over the rear, stern. So either you're going to adjust it. You're not going to want to have the aviation pod coming into the middle of your ship, are you? You're going to have the one that's slipping in and taking off, because that's the easiest, quickest, and safest route. You can figure that out very quickly. You're not going to want to have midships landing. So either you're going to have a lot of X positions turn into flight decks, or you might lose Y positions as well. Honestly, the British could go with an F3 design or even another Nelrod design in a way for the King George V's, although a 28 knot version, so probably the F3 design, because that fitted the hull profile for a higher speed hull far better. The Nelrod profile fitted better for the maximum armor profile. If you go that route, then you end up with your hangar aft. No, 4472. I am not getting into that yet. I'm going to get into that in the next discussion, and in a couple of slides on. And the French design trends will be incredibly. The French designs would be incredibly pertinent. So you really have an issue here. For aircraft design for everyone, they're going to have to be bigger. It's going to make them better for a lot of things. But it's also going to make things very different for World War II. Think about this from the perspective of the aircraft you'd be flying onto, for the American aircraft coming aboard the British carriers. Well, if they've all been designed with these bigger hangars, and probably bigger lifts as well, and the reason I say bigger lifts is because think about the moving helicopters. The temptation is going to be to try and move two at once, in which case you don't need much of a bigger lift than you already have, but you're going to have a bit of a bigger lift. Suddenly that's going to change things. You can have bigger lifts, you're going to have bigger hangars. All those things about adopting aircraft and all those aircraft size issues are going to not be so much there. Twin engine aircraft, like the Sea Hornet, can become far more viable, far more quickly. And the Japanese carriers, again. Verdun, you've just pointed out that Helios hangars are 15 foot and 14 foot. But the moment I put in the IJN's carriers, I was then going to have to put in the Burn. I was then going to have to put in all sorts of other aircraft, hangar ships and lists, and so I didn't. But pretty much every single nation is going to have to redesign and not go with their designs. Let's be honest, the ones who are going to be most in trouble, you're talking about Helios for the Japanese. Think about certain designs they produced. Ryujo, etc. Think about how top-heavy those were. Imagine the hangars now have to be higher. Now, on the Burn, The the hangar was mostly 21 foot 4 inches high, except for the forward hangar part, which was 16 foot 5 inches, which is forward. And well, yeah, the lower hangar was also interesting in terms of height. So yeah, the burn, fine. Japanese carriers, the British carriers, the American carriers are all going to have a height lift. This is going to be interesting, is all I can say. But also, the thing is, if you've got helicopters being an important part, do you have the Chitoses? Oh, the Chitose class aircraft carrier, not what I was thinking about. Oh, I'm confusing my Japanese ship names. It's Tone class, isn't it? Yeah, Tone class. Well, suddenly the Tone class become a lot more practical if they're helicopter cruisers, but they're far shorter range than their reach. How does that affect things? Do they go with them? Do they go with seaplanes? What do they do? Do they try and go a combination of both? You have changed so much with this. Because you've changed the nature of ASW warfare. Instead of, if you're doing an early ASW warfare in World War II, what am I talking about? I'm talking about 2 or 3 ships needed, at least, to engage a vessel. You'd have one fixing of its ASDIC, you'd have another one attacking with depth charges if it's underwater. Well, the helicopters will be diving around patrolling. You need at least 16 of them wandering around, but you can have that with a couple of sloops and a merchant vessel, and if you have some more sloops there or more escorts, you've changed the matters enough. Suddenly 4 or 5 escorts is enough for a convoy, especially if they've got 16 helicopters backing them up. A really important convoy? Oh well, yeah. Add in another 8 helicopters from another escort, a converted merchant escort. Makes it's a lot easier to add in one of those with 8 helicopters, and then you can guarantee 2 helicopters in the air and 2 on alert at all times. You can guarantee with 8 aircraft, you can guarantee you can have 2 in the air and 2 on alert. Suddenly your Wolfpack scenario of submarines is kind of reversed, because your submarine gets caught. Ah, we spotted a submarine. We've confirmed it on ASDIC. We don't want to move and lose it on ASDIC, so well, one of you pop over here and drop some depth charges. Oh yeah, 2 helicopters come over. Boom, boom, drop depth charges. Have we sunk it? Not sure. Okay, we'll go back and rearm. 2 more on their way. Does the submarine surface? If it does, hello, we're waiting with rockets. Before you've even got on the surface, before you've even got to the point at which your crew can open the doors, you've got rockets hitting the hull. Well, that's the reality for anti-submarine warfare. The reality for aircraft carriers is going to be a complete and utter redesign, which is going to affect everything in terms of the size and scale of aircraft you're on there, because it's not going to be short-term. This is going to have started at the very beginning of the 1930s, which means it's going to affect the Ark Royal. It's going to affect some of the rebuilds. It's going to affect the illustrious class, but it's also going to affect some of the ordering, because it's going to mean some carriers which can't be converted, i.e. courageous, glorious, and furious, which can't be made big enough, are going to want to be scrapped sooner because they can't take helicopters. They're not big enough to do it. So you're going to change so much history. The thing I'm sort of meaning there is, if you want to replace those ships sooner, well, you don't want to replace Eagle as soon. Eagle's viable, so you want to keep her in. But, okay, so Eagle can take them. Argus can't. Furious can't. Hermes can't. Courageous and Glorious can't. Okay, so I need to replace 5. Ark Royal can, and Eagle can, so that's 2 of my 7 when I'm ordering the Illustrious class. Well, I ordered a 4 Illustrious class and Implacable and Indefatigable. And I probably ordered them pretty much at the same time. I might well bring forward the ordering. I might change the designs around. I might, because I've had to make them bigger anyway, go with one design fits all. Rather than having a later planned strike sort of armoured carrier, have a straight up armoured carrier. I might have to rework the treaties. Who knows what I'm going to have to do to make this viable? But something is going to have to change to accommodate all this. And Maximus, irreplace cam ships. Pretty much. It's a lot easier and a lot quicker to make than a cam ship. A lot less technically difficult. Because, let's be honest, what you're talking about is sticking a shed on top of a shed and a flat piece of solid deck on board a merchant ship. You don't have to have a full-length flight deck for a helicopter carrier. You don't have to have anything like that. You need a hangar space and you need a flight deck space. Do you know what was the timeline of the heli design advancement resulting in helis of lesser height? Well, the thing is, helis could be of theoretically sort of lesser height, but the trouble is the helicopters aren't being built this high for the fun of things. It's because it fits with the earlier form of the technology. It makes it easier, especially when they have radial engines and etc. being used. So while they're having radial engines etc. being used, they actually grow higher and higher with the more powerful radial engines. So that's what's driving their height. It's using radial engines on the earlier helicopters. Somebody using there rather than putting this. I think this all nicely. The thing is, historically, we're talking about when we talk about helicopters coming in. They're coming in the 1950s when hangars have already increased in height because of dealing with jet aircraft and the bigger size of jets and maintaining them. So, to an extent, they can fit because of that. It doesn't. That's pretty much what I'm running on. Pretty much what I'm talking about with Aztec system is you would be carrying a dipping. You would have a dipping microphone to an extent on the end of what some of the earlier systems are. They actually, some of them are a two-headed dipping probe, which has one dip which can be used for generating a ping and one for listening. And they're sort of basically trying to listen for it. But there are various systems being looked at in the 1920s and 30s, not just as part of Aztec, as part of the oceanographic research going on. There's a lot of oceanographic research going on, especially in the field of... Well, I do know that when they were actually producing dipping sonars, they were looking at some of the technology and stuff used in the early 1930s to do with the listening into the attempts to study underwater volcanoes. So there is sort of things around. It's not what we would call dipping sonar in terms of technology, but it's not so far away that if you weren't sufficiently motivated with the desire for it, you couldn't get something into service. AB-102 comes in 1959, piston engine, 10-foot 7-inch in height. Yeah, but if I remember correctly, AB-102... that's the Augusta Bell, and that has a brand new generation Pratt & Whitney radial engine. And it's based on the Bell 40. It's an advancement on the Bell H-12. And the Bell H-12 has a height of 11 foot 3¼ inches. And that's sort of used by the United States Air Force, but they only produce 13 of them. Mainly because it's very difficult to support and maintain. So, how do I put this? It's possible to produce smaller helicopters. Please note, there is a good argument to producing smaller helicopters, maybe cutting the cloth to fit the hangar height. But it's going to add difficulty to maintenance and to their space operations, and their size and their scope and ability to carry personnel. And again, one of the criteria given to me was Westland Whirlwind Wessex, and not just because Westland Wessex, and not a Whirlwind, Westland Whirlwind, and not just because of it, but because of its availability and capabilities, but also I presume because the next generation after it is the Wessex. And the Wessex is a really, truly versatile vessel, well, a helicopter, which can carry 16 troops, or can do anti-submarine warfare, can do all sorts of interesting VIP transport. And the Wessex comes in at a height of 15 foot 10 inches. Peter Dawson. Okay, hedgehog or squid is better than depth charges. Yes and no. The reason they're better is not because they're better than depth charges, but because they're better because the ship doesn't have to lose ASDIC contact to fire them, so it can give more precise information to them to use. B, you can't really fit either to a helicopter and use them like that. So whilst I can see where you're coming from, it's not really a viable alternative. And submarines in World War II are not so quiet, especially in the period we're talking about mainly, which is the beginning of World War II. It's how things developed to try and get them. That you have to really worry about the idea of, well, that you have to sort of really worry about the whole stealth thing for submarines. Honestly, rafting mountings for machinery in submarines was not developed until the 1960s. So, submarines have an interesting time prior to that. But really, yeah. There is rafting is an important step in the stealthing of submarines against acoustic systems. And there is some reality here when we're talking about these helicopters. I do realize we're talking about definitely the larger helicopters of the spectrum rather than the smaller helicopters. And there is, I think, a reason for that in that they are a more fully rounded package in terms of warfare for these sort of operations. So that's another reason why it's worthwhile for carriers making the adjustments for them. That said, would it make sense to replace the 4-inch gun on the back of a long merchant with a helicopter pad instead? No, because think about it from this perspective, Dirt Squad. If you're trying to sustain helicopter operations, do you want to have a load of helicopters spread across all sorts of ships, having to have the air crew to operate them on all those ships and all the accommodations on air crew, the maintenance crew and all their supplies and stores aboard all those ships, and have to replicate the personnel to support them across all those ships? Would you rather have the 4-inch guns to deal with things like condors and maybe also deal with submarine if it does actually get too close on those ships, and also give them a bit of reassurance, whilst you put the helicopters together so you can have one store system to maintain the stores and supplies for those helicopters, a whole load of what a far larger engineering team, because instead of having the engineering team to support one helicopter, you'd have the engineering team required to support 8 helicopters, which is going to have far more depth in case of issues to deal with things. There is advantages to scale in this scenario. Peter Dawson, just writing Atlantic Conveyor doesn't help me, but I'm not sure what you're putting that in there. If you're suggesting that putting all the eggs in one basket is a problem, well, it is if you're then going to use that basket as part of your missile defense and it actually something leaks through and hits it. In this scenario, if you're dealing with a high-risk convoy, you probably have a couple of them along. If you're dealing with a low-risk scenario, you have one of them along, and you have a couple of sloops along, which can also take 4 hours, I've already discussed. It's one of those scenarios where, yeah, we can. There are all sorts of smart things we can think about and points we can think about in terms of warfare, and the Atlantic Conveyor, sadly enough, was in a position where it was considered highly critical and useful, but it was considered secondary to the aircraft carriers, which is probably right. So it was in the innermost defences, but just in front of the carriers, and it sadly got the hit. But that happens. Atlantic Conveyor got sunk. That's a shame. It's terrible for the crew, for the people who lost their relatives. But as a one-word catch-all for not using a converted merchant vessel to provide the cornerstone of your defense, doesn't really add up when you've got Mac ships and all sorts of things, and the escort carriers themselves, for quite a lot few of them in World War II. They're viable. It's a useful system, and it's quite easy to adapt. Might see Eagle, which had a 20-foot ceiling, become an early helicopter assault ship commando carrier. Could do. Could well see Eagle being used in that role. It's going to depend on how quickly they get into the sort of the role and have the larger helicopters available. I think the assault troop scenario is going to be particularly interesting as we get into this, because one of the things we often forget is in the 1920s, 30s, there is a lot of development going on in amphibious warfare. I know we don't get to forget this on my channel because I'm always reminding you of it, and I know quite a few of you are interested in it. But the thing is, in the 20s and 30s, there is a lot of development going on into amphibious warfare. And helicopters have an advantage. They have a huge advantage over parachute, and in that you can direct where they're going to land, like gliders. But they have a great advantage over gliders in that they don't tend to land by crashing into things, so reusable. And even more importantly than all of that, they can be used to pull people out afterwards. This is all advantageous. This is all useful. This is all skillful. This is all something which matters, something which is of value to a navy. It's a scenario you have to deal with, because for amphibious warfare, the problem for the British has always been how quickly you can get the troops ashore, but also where you can get the troops to the targets they need to get them. They're always obsessed with the idea of using a motivated small force to really maximal effect. So if you're using the Royal Marines and you're using the various forces, if you think about it, you suddenly can get maximum effect from your impact. You can land 8, you can land 16 troops in a spot. And if they have got their equipment with them, then they can really do what they need to do. It's a problem in terms of the first helicopters are not really going to be that great at dealing with air defenses, etc. But, again, you have two things coming up very quickly with the British and with the Americans. Because I wouldn't be surprised if the Americans get into this as well. Excuse me. That was a more normal cough. I think the Americans probably get into this quite perspective. With their experience of what was going on in the Philippines, etc., I think they could get into helicopter operations in a big way. I wouldn't be surprised if the Japanese try and push into this scenario, because, again, I can see the IJA and the IJN having a fight over helicopters. And for the IJA, it's always going to be about reconnaissance and troop movement. It's always going to be about reconnaissance and troop movement. And so the IJN are going to get involved in that anyway to compete with them. So the British will be pushing along, and the British will probably think about it in terms of night insertions. So think about this from the perspective of the Germans. Imagine, in the middle of the night, you are watching the beach. The Marines come from behind you. And they disappear off behind you. They never at any point actually go to the beach. Again, their helicopters get picked up and taken out. It becomes intriguingly possible, intriguingly interesting about how the things can be dealt with. Again, you have to start thinking about, for the British, from an empire perspective, this is where these larger helicopters especially become useful for cruisers. Think about it from an empire perspective. You want to visit an island. What's more impressive to do? Turn up in your big ship and land, or come appear from the sky and just come in and there's suddenly 16 of you here. And then very quickly, shortly afterwards, a big ship appears on the horizon. Which is the better theatrics? Because again, please don't think Royal Navy cruiser commanders do not go in for the theatrics. This is one of the points that's often made about the Royal Navy in the 1920s and 30s and their officer corps. The destroyer officers are basically things you have to hold on to and prevent them from breaking out their cages to go and rip other people apart. They are sufficiently aggressive, they will have a fight with a pane of glass, let alone a mirror. That's their purpose. That is what they're trained and orientated to be. The cruiser captains, and sometimes the crew officers do both. They do destroyers and they epitomize the aggression, and then they go into the cruisers, and suddenly you've got an officer who a few weeks ago was super going, yeah, we'll go get them, is now doing the theatrics of display. Because they understand what the roles of a destroyer versus a cruiser are. And a cruiser, it's all about image. Your ship is going to gleam. Your ship is going to resonate its presence wherever it goes. Imagine again the SS Vincent de Paul incident, this incident in Tsingtao in January 1939, when Birmingham turns up. Imagine if before Birmingham's even got into harbour, if before Birmingham has even finished docking and putting itself, before Birmingham's even just appeared over the horizon, if that midshipman's party, which let's be honest is short, small, fewer than 16, roughly 8 in strength, is landed by helicopter on the SS Vincent de Paul, before anyone can really do anything, before the Japanese really know the British are there, they've already got a party on the Vincent de Paul. And the cruisers coming in. If you want a really scary thing, think about what Lieutenant General Carson de Wiart could get up to with a helicopter force. They've already had a question about air mobile divisions being used at D-Day. I'm not worried about D-Day. I have got Carson de Wiart with an air mobile brigade in Norway. That is a scary, scary scenario to me. For you, if you don't know who I'm talking about with Adrian Carton de Wiart, in which case you've missed the videos on amphibious warfare in Norway where I've talked about him, go look him up. Then imagine that man, who is the living embodiment of the Black Knight from Monty Python, in charge of an air mobile brigade. If you do not think that he somehow finds a way to march that brigade all the way to Berlin, or at least tries to, then you are underestimating him. Underestimating him a lot. What's easier to replace, a fleet carrier or a cargo ship? The math does not lie. Whilst conspiracy nuts think it was to use as a shield, it's more likely normal procedures put it there and got it a hit. Yes. That's the thing. The thing about the conspiracy nuts is they think it's a conspiracy it was used as a shield, but actually it, along with the other 3 large cargo ships, which were large enough but also important enough, were used as that line there because they were a last line of defense for the carriers. Because it was better they get hit than a carrier. They prefer none of them be hit, which is why they're where they are within the formation. But if you have to pick between one of them getting hit, you're going to pick that. It's kind of like, you're not giving them a good option here. You're giving them a dilemma. You're giving them, there's no good option. But the least worst option for the Royal Navy in the Falklands War, for Britain in the Falklands War, is Atlantic Conveyor over Hermes or Invincible. It's just, you don't want either of those hits. How long do you think it would be until 4 Marines decide to strap themselves on the side of the early helicopters in time and make ad-lib air cav? Well, don't take this the wrong way, but there's a reason why I included these helicopters in here, because they can test and technically take 3 passengers internally. All right, the Royal Navy one can take 3 passengers internally. That's with seats. If you take out the seats, you can probably fit 4 people in. Maybe even 5 or 6. And then if you're really interesting, you can maybe push that up to 8 if you're prepared to get really close to people. I'm talking London Tube, rush hour, crush close to people. You can probably push it up to 8. I'm not speaking as to the weight load of it taking off, but it'll be interesting. But do I put that past the Royal Marines, the Royal Navy boarding teams thinking about trying that for something? No, I don't. I don't.
And the thing is, the moment they try and do it once and it proves interesting, then that's going to have an effect. This is the point I always make about development being sort of like, well, let's do this one. Like that. Because the thing is, the more you can do something, the more you try doing something. The more you try doing something, the more you're going to do it. And yes, dropping off and picking up spies. Well, that's usually done by the Westland Whirlwind. It'll be done by helicopters. And that's going to change things completely. Without seats, 3 Marines we go. You have to remember, you're talking gear is very different than we necessarily talk about today. And if you're traveling in light fighting order, it's a lot less than you might be thinking of. So you could probably do more. 4 Marines on the cabin, another 4 strapped on, hanging out the doors with the door bit removed. But quite potentially, there's all sorts of modifications they can make. So, this is a real point. With amphibious warfare, you have helicopters involved. You're going to have a different scenario. And, again, you've talked about Eagle being... Well, the thing is, if Eagle's assigned, because if we consider HMS Eagle, if we consider her, and she's worthwhile thinking about, she's not exactly the fastest carrier in the Royal Navy. She's 24 knots. So imagine if in, let's say, 1936, she suddenly gets assigned as an amphibious warfare ship rather than an aircraft carrier. And she's no longer part of the amphibious warfare. And they go, well, yes, she's more than 2,000 tons. We do know, but the auxiliaries are allowed to be quite large, and if we necessary, and there are under the treaties there are designations for auxiliaries. Yes, she's sort of fast, but we're going to reduce her armament down to what's appropriate for an auxiliary and all sorts of things. And she's an auxiliary ship for amphibious warfare. That suddenly takes her tonnage out of the Royal Navy carrier groupings. And if that takes her 22,200 tons out of the tonnage, and they're getting rid of others, and Argus is dropped out, that suddenly they might actually even order 2 Ark Royals at the same time. There's all sorts of interesting permutations that can happen. Yeah, all of a sudden, how far would a helicopter have to be from a sentry not to be heard? Could sound masking be employed? How far not to be heard? You're probably talking a fair distance, but the sentries are mostly focused on the other direction. And you could even keep them focused on the other direction. If you think about it, you could have ships wandering around offshore doing all sorts of fun things to keep them constantly looking out forward, because they're going to be looking seaward. And the moment, let's put this again. Okay, think about it from an expense point of view. If you're attacking the Atlantic Wall, the moment you attack the Atlantic Wall once or twice from the rear, the moment you do attacks like that, especially if you do them quickly enough after each other, you're only going to be able to get away with it for a short period of time. But the moment you do so, what are the Germans going to have to do? They're going to have to secure all their Atlantic Wall to defend themselves from the rear, which is going to double their cost. Think about that. Think about going along the length of the Atlantic Wall the Germans built, after they've built it, and going, right then, we now have to add defences facing that way. The whole length along. And the thing is, you also no longer have to rely so much on SOE, etc. for destroying things behind enemy lines. Seize Pegasus Bridge? Well, that's going to be an interesting task. Fine, we can do that. Helicopters, drop them in here, here, here. They know exactly where they're dropped in. It's not going to be like gliders. If they miss the field, if they land in the wrong field, they're taken out by wires. So, that's all a factor. But the problem is, it won't just be the Allies. And someone's already in Crete. It won't just be the Allies who have helicopters. It will not just be the Allies. Although it could be interesting, because helicopters mainly develop as support tools. So the thing is, how much focus will the Luftwaffe want to give to a support tool? That could actually cause fights between the Abwehr and the Luftwaffe. It could cause fights between them. It could be a very interesting scenario for quite a long time. Could be quite a complicated scenario. Italy and Japan will also develop them, and it's going to have an impact on things. If Japan has a viable anti-submarine submarine helicopter, well, the thing is, we always rely on the fact that Japanese anti-submarine warfare is not very good because they can't rapidly produce escort carriers and they can't rapidly get aircraft for them. But let's be honest, if they have helicopters in service which are capable for anti-submarine warfare, as I've been over with repeatedly, to create a merchant carrier for helicopters, it's not the same work as for an aircraft, because you don't need a full-length flight deck. So if necessary, you can literally stick a shed, aka hangar, and a big piece of steel on there. As long as it's properly supported and sustained, it can do it. And honestly, the hangar can double as your storage for your stores. A large part of your stores can be stored in there. Or you can build a structure underneath them which houses your stores and accommodation for all your personnel for aviation, your engineers and your pilots. So it gets really, really different very quickly once you're talking about this being utilized. Once you're talking about aviation in terms of carriers being used, in terms of helicopters being part of that aviation perspective, you have changed the scenario quite greatly from the get-go. And again, Stafford Thompson, you've just said, basically, if they are used throughout World War II, considering the amount of development that takes place in terms of aviation, etc., in World War II, which is mainly more powerful engines and better designs coming online quite quickly, I wouldn't be surprised if you see 2 to 3 generations of, well, we see roughly 3 generations of aircraft in World War II. We'd see 3 generations of helicopters in World War II. We'd have the helicopters in service in 1939. We'd have the helicopters in service in 1941-42. We'd have the helicopters in service in 1944-45, and sort of the in-between eras. That's when they'd sort of be roughly appearing, and there would be differences and there would be step-ups in those things. So I think you'd have a Wessex style thing, probably 1942, 41, 42. For the British, because they probably already be working on it when they're deploying when they've got a Whirlwind level of thing. And then what's going to come after that? There might even be a trophy race for helicopters in the 30s. Who knows? But the reality is going to be that a lot of powers are going to be investing in them, which is going to produce a lot of interesting ideas. If you think about it, the way the Germans work, they're going to come in the 1930s. In the mid to late 1930s, they're suddenly going to start investing, because that's when Hitler rises to power and the money actually gets freed up, really, for their armed forces to start investing. Mussolini's going to be in it from the get-go, let's be honest. The Italian fat boy, fun boy, is going to be in it from the get-go. He's going to be raring to go with helicopters, which is going to cause an interesting thing. The Reggio Marina has a seaplane carrier. They might end up with a helicopter carrier as well. And you have all the utility for the helicopters. Again, another reason why I think the troop carrying variants actually probably come about even earlier than they did historically is because of some of the issues you have
in policing empire in this period. So you probably have the French involved in it. And the interesting thing that starts to have a factor, if the French have helicopters in World War II, does that in any way compensate for their terrible ability to communicate with each other, but via radio? Does it? Because the helicopters can pop up and tell you the Germans are coming from that direction. There are potentially all sorts of interesting scenarios that could go ahead. This is why I'm not getting into the actual events of World War II, because it changes things quite so much. It changes things colossally, because, for example, does anyone think that Sweden wouldn't get involved in the helicopter race? And if Sweden's got helicopters, Norway's going to want to have helicopters. Finland's just been fighting a war against the Russians. They're going to want them. Poland. Poland has quite an interesting aero manufacturing industry in the 1920s and 30s, mainly because of fighting wars of pretty much everyone for their existence in that period. They could well also want to have helicopters. The Soviet Union's going to be doing what they always do, which is try and pretend they have something, if not have something, and then pretend it's a lot better than it actually is. Usually what they produce is quite interestingly solid designs in some regards, and then claim they're all singing or dancing. And you're sort of thing going, no, it's a perfectly serviceable design, but it's not all singing or dancing. I kid you not, I once had a conversation with someone who honestly believed that a Hind helicopter was capable of going past the speed of sound. And I have no idea. They were showing me something which was pure Soviet propaganda from, I don't know when, I think it was in the late 1980s. And they're going, yeah, this proves it. And I was going, how did you even get in this room? It was at a history conference. I am of a great belief that all should be able to come to history conferences, I really do. But some people come in and really set themselves up for ridicule. Hind helicopters being capable of going past the faster than the speed of sound. Maybe when they're crashing, but no end. Just no. What? Also, I don't understand. Why do I always get the people come and talk to me? Do I look that friendly? I have a beard. And I can fix... I can even make myself have resting, growling face, and people still come talk to me. This is a problem. I don't want them to come talk to me. Especially not when they're that. I can only hold my tongue for so long. How many Vickers machine guns and how much ammo could one hang on a Dragonfly helicopter? I don't want to think about that. Probably few. That's good. Given the French guns' pathological theory of the arsenals, I can't imagine there being a reasonable doctrine around helicopters being allowed to form. That could be interesting. It could be the fact that the French could actually end up doing themselves out of it. But there again, if the Italians are investing in helicopters, will the French not be able to? Will the French not invest in helicopters? Because that's what you get into. Honestly, when you're talking about national developments of this scale, you're often talking about very, very cheesy, fundamentally stupid, petty grievances driving a lot of the funding. BlackburnMaximus, Dunkirk evacuation with helicopters. You could have all sorts of... In a nicer way, you could imagine Calais evacuations. Especially the British night flying. Again, we can tackle this in. Add this into the Royal Navy's love for night flying, and they would be evacuating people from Dunkirk beaches by helicopter and from Calais at night. A lot of those troops which have to be lost or even abandoned could disappear in the middle of the night. Italian fascism was particularly in love with machinery and especially aviation. Firmajet effects with helicopters and the prospect of them being a true trailblazer. Oh yeah, I know. There are going to be, if you've pushed this through, And the thing is, you don't need much funding to turn it into a viable, considering all the developments that were going on in the 1920s and 30s, historically anyway, with helicopter aviation. Only someone getting a serious competition between the British and the Americans is going to just tip the balance. And once the balance will be tipped, everyone else is going to be pouring in. And that's the thing. It's something which is so on the cusp. It's so on the cusp for so long in that period. It's really not that much difficult. I would point out that you're the type of person who does give off friendly, helpful man with beard vibes. Matt Masters, you look very approachable when smiling. Curse it. Curse it. We have a helicopter in the 40s that can travel 400 miles per hour faster, carry 8 people, and has radar, and is fully armed with machine guns and bombs. Yeah. Look, that's the only time I find the things really annoying is when you're talking about something which is actually a serviceable piece of kit for its period and is very decent, and then people are tacking on things which are just not true about it to try and turn it into some sort of mega weapon when it's a perfectly decent, capable weapon. It's good enough on its own standing. It doesn't need weird propaganda about it. It's like anyone claiming a tank is undefeatable. It's just not. Nothing is undefeatable. There is no such thing. Anything created by the human mind can be destroyed by the human mind. That is a fundamental belief I have, because either it's going to be a case of tactics, strategy, or technology. You can find a way to stop anything. Let's go. The French invested in the tanks and got the Char B1 and ran on R35. They invested in carry and got the burn. Well, you know, let's be honest. The French would probably invest in helicopters. And I would just like to point out, I think what the French route would be is the French would probably end up with some of the world's best quadcopters. Honestly, I think that's the route the French would end up going. So they would have some really cool quadcopters. Greater push for higher power compact engines for helicopters could really help the fleet out. It could do. Oh, we don't know that yet. You have a stranger saying the ugliest heli ever made. Look, it will either be very beautiful, it'll either be a helicopter which only its designer could love, or it'll be completely and utterly terrible. Sometimes the French do get stuff which is ridiculously brilliant. The tech is then shamelessly pinched and improved on by the British. Yes, in this period that is often how things go. If the French get something right, the British nick it and then produce a better version of it, and usually do such a good marketing job of it that they get all the credit. So, I know, we're getting the summary rather quickly, but I thought if this was going to be a 3-hour live as it normally is, I'd leave about 20 minutes for discussion at the end. Because I thought that with last night's video about the competition and today's video, there's going to be plenty of questions. In fact, I might even make that slide longer. Summary. This, of course, is a modern crow's nest. It's all sorts of fun in development, because apparently it's quite a big issue to actually try and work out how to rip a radar bag and radar off a Sea King and attach it to a Merlin. I make it sound ridiculously easy. It is, of course, a lot more complicated, especially when you're trying to update the electronics and everything and actually get even more of it while still paying minimal, lowest lowest price possible. It is amazing how long and complicated those procedures can then become. But leaving that to one side, one of the things I do think, and did want to mention as an early concept here, is the air search radar on helicopters. Now, we've of course talked about dipping sonar, but I could see the air search radar becoming something of them far more quickly. Because dipping sonar is possible, it is going to take effort, but it is going to be possible. We know historically when air search radar develops. We know when that comes into service. I can see that being used on helicopters very quickly for the whole convoy protection. I could see it becoming a standard fit. And it could be really interesting how that would change things. Because if it came as a standard fit that helicopters were built as standard to have an air surface search radar. Maybe they actually have it built in, but from air surface search radar, it's not a long way to go to developing an air search radar. The British actually very quickly do start trying to use it for both roles. It doesn't necessarily work that well for both roles, please note, but the British are trying it. The British are always willing to try anything, to be honest, in the middle of the war. The British turn from being this sort of nation which goes, maybe, to, ooh, that sounds like an interesting idea. Let's give it a go. Maybe versus, ooh, I wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of that if it works. Let's try it out. It's an amazing turn. Hello, Melanie. That's the reality. And the thing is, the advantage of the helicopters is because to deal with the downdraft anyway, they're all internal. Think about it from this perspective. In terms of versus the swordfish, air search radar on a helicopter, it's internal. The crew are inside. You have the electronics protected from, automatically protected from the outside, automatically protected from the rain, protected from the elements. That's going to make things interesting. You could carry an extra crewman in there who's the radio operator. You could carry 4 people. If you think about sort of the Wessex and the Whirlwind, you could do that. And a radar. At a certain point, you could be providing a lot of capability. And you have a lot of interesting people around, Barn, well, sort of interested by Melanie, that could make these things possible. And again, the more useful the more you use the helicopter, the more you're going to have the ideas for the helicopter. The more useful you make the helicopter, the more you're going to be using the helicopter, and the more you're going to have ideas for it. It's the same with all aircraft types. But the really big change I think this can make is in our post-World War II scenario. Because think about it from the perspective of, if World War II has gone as it happened, and as I said, I'm not sure. Maybe Hitler still puts in the funding towards the submarine service. Maybe he doesn't. If the first happy time doesn't go as well as it did historically, because they're all getting killed, and they're losing a lot more submarines a lot more quickly, because they're having to deal with these. Well, not this specifically. They wouldn't be dealing with Merlin, but, you know, you get the point. Because they're dealing with helicopters. Then maybe he doesn't invest in. Maybe the Type 22s, etc., don't come into existence. Type 21s and you know, all the advanced submarines do not come into existence. Who knows what happens then post Cold War with the high-speed submarine race? I think it would still happen. I still think you'd get the nuclear-powered submarines and the high-speed submarines. But there again, let's put it this way: if you're a Royal Navy officer in the 1950s, and someone says, "Oh, they've produced a high-speed submarine." Okay. How fast can it go? Oh, 30 knots. Oh, cool. How fast can our helicopters go by that point? They're already going to have probably second-generation dipping sonar, if not third-generation, post-war dipping sonar by that point. They're going to, dipping Aztec or sonar, whatever they're calling it by then. It probably will be called sonar because it would have been sounding nice. They're going to have surface search radar. So if they stick a periscope up, they're going to get that spotted. So do you have the great fear over the Soviet submarines in the 1950s that drives so much of aviation, so much of the Royal Navy and other nations' ship development and decision making? Do we even develop the Ikara? If you already got helicopters in service that are reliable, flying from everything, because this is the fundamental point. Wartime service, okay, maybe I build the Flower-class corvettes as I did historically, but do I build the frigates as I did historically? If I'm building a vessel bigger already, or even the Castle-class corvettes, bigger, am I going to, if I'm building them already sloop-sized, or nearly sloop-sized, do I make them a little bit bigger and stick a helicopter hangar and flight deck on them? In which case, in 1950s, I could have so many helicopter-capable hulls floating around, I could be beside myself. Is the difference between destroyers and frigates then? One carries helicopters and one doesn't? And this in the 1950s? The whole thing is, it will have a massive consequence. The course of the war, I can't really predict because I think it changes. The point I would say could change most is if you have helicopters. Let's be honest, let's talk about HMS Warspite. Let's say she has helicopters rather than a swordfish. She might be carrying 2 or 3 of them. She's got the space for them. Imagine 3 helicopters wandering around Narvik while Swordfish is going in. Well, you know, while Warspite's going in. Imagine the targeting they can offer. One of the things which we have to think about. For helicopters especially, and for naval vessels, and, you know, ships, all kinds, etc., is that the laser system and lasers as a sort of a development has been around for quite a while. Now, again, you can't use that in those sort of aircraft. You're not going to be developing it. But there's so many things you're developing as you're developing with ships. What happens if laser targeting comes in earlier? Or any form of accurate targeting. Again, the other advantage for a helicopter is that it can actually hover. It can keep in a similar position. As long as it's outside of the air defense of the enemy, it can keep out of it. Yeah, search radar does need to be centimetric, but it can be. There's options. It's not necessarily it's producing effective air search radar. It's effective producing. They're trying it with surface search and air search radar. The thing is, if we consider the centimetric radar is quite. Let's put it this way. In terms of the Battle Atlantic, it does come in quite early on. It's quite a big thing for the Navy. So, it's. I've got up my notes on centimetric radar. Luckily, I had them from earlier because I had them put up. So they're, to me, they're that side of the screen, I suppose, because they're on that thing. Because I have my notes for this video on. Hang on, I'm pointing the wrong way for you guys. So I think. Hang on. When I look to that side, that's that way. Yeah. So they're that way. My notes for this video. But yeah, Yeah, they could have. It was interesting, but they had some interesting radars at that period. Might see helicopter destroyers like the Haruna class. Might well do. It could be really interesting because if the German surface ships have performed as they did historically, and the German submarines haven't performed that well at all, the Soviets might entirely think that in terms of naval power, they just go defensive. It might change the entire shape of the Cold War. How would a submarine be communicating real-time spotting for artillery that close to inside an enemy harbor without giving away their location? You wouldn't. I think I was talking about a helicopter. It's going to be an interesting scenario what happens after these things come into service. It's going to change a lot of things. Carlos, what was the SW helicopter drone in the 1960s, or even what was that? So there's been lots of interesting things, and again, when we're talking about drone aircraft, you can go back to Super B program, all sorts of systems. So we could well be talking about some sort of assisting helicopter program a lot earlier. BlackburnMaximus type class will be built. Well, yes, I did put the type class in earlier, but it would possibly in a nice way, if you're building this in sort of historically terms, you might build it with an A and B 6-inch gun mounts, and you might not see it here, but you've got port and we used to have port and starboard 3-inch mounts, sort of in these positions, and you might end up with 4 of those, and then the helicopters aft. And they probably smooth out the superstructure and have spacing for it all. So it would all look far nicer and far neater than that. The Soviets might well build more cruisers. They might decide that the peak of the German performance have been the beginning of the war with the Deutschland class. But it's again going to affect how the Deutschland class will deal with by aircraft. Because let's be honest, the Deutschland class would probably have helicopters, as the Germans would have fitted them with by that point, rather than the seaplanes. Definitely the counties would be mounting helicopters. And again, think of it from the British carrier perspective, British cruisers perspective, and weight saving perspective. If you're going for helicopters, you don't need catapults. You don't need all that gear you have for a catapult, and those cranes and systems you have to support the seaplane. You don't need. Okay, you need some other gear to support the helicopters, but it's a lot less in weight. Oh, yeah, I was talking about the helicopter could hover. And potentially, there are laser designators. I was sort of wondering whether they could make it in time, but I don't think they could. But I don't think they would be far behind, because I could imagine that the Warspite could be carrying 2 or 3 of these. Also, that could have an impact on the German submarines just there. Because if there are 3 helicopters wandering around, at least one of them is going to be doing an anti-submarine hunt and going to go, "Hello, did you just fire a torpedo at our ship? Yes, it failed to go off, but we're about to drop some depth charges on you." It would be a case of constant. There'd be. How do I put this politely? If you could, I'm trying to remember the scene from a television program. I'm sure it was. Oh no, it wasn't. It was from. I think it was from Hitman's Bodyguard, where basically, as Samuel Jackson is walking along the street with flowers, going to put them in a position for his wife to see from the jail cell. He's walking along the street. Ryan Reynolds is running around, dealing with various people who are coming out to try and assassinate him. And that would be one of Warspite's helicopters, basically going... One will be spotting forward, one will be scouting even further forward, and one will be playing tail end Charlie going, where is that? Oh, there you are, right then, you're mine. Laser designators World War II. It's a case of, I was trying to think, maybe they could have radio designators, actually. I'm just thinking, because if you can hover, and that's the point, if you can hover, could you stabilize the designator enough with 1930s, 1940s technology to target and focus something in? Because if you could, and you do use radar-directed fire control, but that's late World War II, so I don't think so. But it was an idea my brain went down the route of, I have to admit. Your crew will likely reduce as well. Handling facilities will be on average shorter, closer to waterline. Then you save all the volume you spent on the sporting systems. Potentially. But you're going to be carrying probably more of them. I wouldn't be surprised if you did carry 2 to 3 helicopters. And you probably have to want to carry the air crew to be operating them all. And remember again, there's not going to be the whole time of taking them out of the water, all that time of delay of operations, etc. They're going to be land, they're going to be maintained, all those things. So it's going to be forcing against, so you might end up with 3 aircraft and 4 air crews, maybe 5 air crews on a cruiser. And probably would be looking at, how many fitters would you want? Oh. You're probably looking at roughly 18 fitters if you're going to be doing 24-hour operations. With probably in the crewing of this period, this is what I'm doing with, not today's lean crewing. Please note, before someone comes in goes, the Royal Navy today would not do that many for that. No, you wouldn't, but the Royal Navy of the 1930s would. Once you're doing 24-hour operations, etc., and going to be doing the level of operation that they'd be looking at 18 fitters plus a couple of chiefs plus probably a couple of maybe an engineering officer. Possibly 2 engineering officers, so they have a couple of them, a junior and a senior. So you're looking at, with 4 per air crew, you're looking at 20 flight crew, probably roughly 20 on the engineering side, so you're probably looking at roughly 40 personnel for 3 aircraft. Sometimes, Doc, I don't think you fully realise how easily you give me ideas. Thank you. No, I don't think you didn't make the electronics necessary to discriminate and calculate a laser signal in the 1940s. I know, I don't think you could. But I was trying to think on the ideas, and I started off with laser designator, was working my way back through the various designation systems. I'm not sure if you could get a radar radio designation system to work in this period either. At this period. But, you know, it's an idea. The point still stands that the more you operate them and the more you have them, the more ideas they're going to have for them. Yeah, there's going to be very interesting organizational priorities. But the thing is, again, it could be really interesting watching Churchill come in and go, I want to stop building capital ships to build
escorts, and they go, well, we're already building the escorts, and besides, this is how we do anti-submarine warfare now. Let us take you out in a helicopter, sir, and show you what we do. I want helicopters! Lots of them! Thank you, Churchill. Go get us helicopters. We all know what he was like with tech. Wire-guided missile system. Potentially get a wire-guided... Well, they probably will have rockets, etc. There are options for command guidance. Radio control visual guidance would work. Yeah, but I'm talking about being able to designate the guns for warspite. So if a could, is there any system you could get in the 1940s, early 1940s, in World War II sort of era, late 1930s, early 1940s, that could be used for targeting the guns remotely from a helicopter to aim them? And I think you could probably have some form of radio repeating system, whereby, because they did look at it, but aircraft, the thing is the spotter planes are moving, so it wasn't, so visual correction was about as accurate as you could get. But with a helicopter, its hovering could be close enough to stable enough for the splash and firepower and accuracy of 15-inch, 16-inch, and 14-inch guns, that it could necessarily actually do something more. I don't know. I don't think that is actually possible. Now, the more I think about it, it's an idea I can imagine them trying to work out how to do. I just don't think it's possible. I think it's going to be radio control visual guidance. I think it is going to be that. Yeah. But still, it would be fun. Imagine if you could, just for a moment, just ignore all the physics and issues of it. Just imagine being able to laser designate from a helicopter this entire salvo of USS Iowa, so that everything lands within a meter. All 9 shells land within a meter of each other. Just imagine that. A warspite I've been over. I think she would have 3 helicopters on Narvik. I think, honestly, you would have far more aircraft if they were using helicopters, because the reason they reduce the number of aircraft on British ships is because you have to stop to pick them up. And so that affects their utility dramatically. Actually using those aircraft is a big thing. If you've got helicopters that can land and recover on ships, it is going to be interesting how it affects the design of the Queen Elizabeth class and redesign, because do you want those helicopters to have to land amidships? Now, you can theoretically make that space big enough for a helicopter to tuck in and land amidships. You can do that, but it's not going to be easy as an over-the-rear landing. So who knows what kind of modifications they might make or try and think about for that. But you could see guided or semi-guided shells start to crop up before. Oh, you could. In fact, honestly, you could see that the 6-inch guns could definitely be around with the guided, and that could make, if the 6-inch guns are guided, then that could make an interesting discussion for what guns you put on your destroyers. I could see the 6-inch guns being retained, and the modern firepower being all 6-inch guns because they got guided shells to them. Because they probably get guided shells to them before they got guided shells for 5-inch or 4.5-inch. It's a really interesting thing to think about, the amount of helicopters coming early, because it's going to change quite so much. It really is. Next week, by the way, the Tuesday video is supposed to be conception, operation, conclusion of the Ark Royals, because they're a good history of aviation, really. They are. Let's go into tribals and battles of Helios. I don't think destroyers get helicopters. And I have a reason for that. I don't think, because destroyers are so much around their torpedo attack, what do you have to take off them to accommodate the helicopters? Because they're limited in tonnage.
I think the treaty limitations do them in. Whereas sloops, because the British produce them to roughly 1,250 tons, they can easily, because their limit is 2,000 tons, easily add in helicopters and absorb the extra tonnage. That's not going to affect them much. So sloops get helicopters, cruisers will get helicopters, battleships will get helicopters, carriers will get helicopters, but I don't see destroyers getting helicopters in World War II. I just don't see it happening. But that could be said, that you could suddenly find some sloops are rather quick and keeping up with the destroyers when they're doing their operations, like Narvik, etc., like Claymore, etc., Operation Claymore. If the helicopter could hover directly above the ship, it would be a better have a better view for improving your visual targeting if they hover 5,000 feet up. Well, let's be honest. The Westland Whirlwind can do, if I'm not mistaken, and I often am, but I don't think I'm mistaken. The Westland Whirlwind can do up to 13,000 feet. That's its ceiling. So if you've got helicopters operating up to that height, and remember, the service ceiling for the Swordfish is 16,500 feet, so and that's at full load, pretty much. Service ceiling for a Swordfish is 16,500 feet, with weighing 7,580 pounds. So for a Westland Whirlwind, which is doing a maximum takeoff weight of 7,800 pounds. 13,000 feet, yeah, that's fine. I think, honestly, that's probably what you'd be dealing with, and they could do. So they could be doing the spotting from 1,000, 2,000 feet with big, very powerful glasses above the ship. I don't know about the film camera and the IQ 4002. That's so micro, that's beyond it. As said, the reason I haven't gone much into World War II is because, honestly, the helicopters involved change things so dramatically. Let's consider this. Let's say Royal Oak survives. Doesn't get sunk at Scapa Flow because of the helicopters patrolling Scapa Flow. And let's say Royal Oak is running short of fuel. So instead of Glorious coming home on her own, she's tagged in with Royal Oak, because she's also coming home. Do Scharnhorst and Gneisenau sink HMS Glorious in that scenario? Or do they see Royal Oak sitting there and go, frigate, that's a full battleship, we're getting out of here? Does the Admiral, who might well be aboard Royal Oak, have aircraft airborne and have an aerial patrol going on? If he has his own helicopters, because she'll probably be fitted to carry helicopters, and let's say Glorious will have helicopters, they probably do have helicopters airborne. Well, that's going to change the things anyway. Even if you don't have Royal Oak survive, if Glorious has helicopters, might well have helicopters airborne. Because no matter what version of history you have for that scenario, helicopters are require very different operational scenarios from the other aircraft, so they might well still be operating. They're not going to be involved in strikes and things like that. So the entire history of World War II changes dramatically. If we talk about the anti-submarine operations, which lose Courageous, go to that one, and Ark Royal doing that. Well, if you've got helicopters buzzing around as well as aircraft for anti-submarine duties, does a submarine get close enough to get to her? I don't know. Still might, it might not. But there's going to be something different going on in the anti-submarine warfare patrols. It's going to change things. So you can't really predict World War II if you're making this much of a change. I can predict World War II if you've gone through with the F3's designs instead of Naval designs. You leave everything else the same. Because, in a nice way, if you've got a 15-inch 50 in service, you're going to upgrade upgrade your battleships. You're going to upgrade all your 15-inch battleships are going to get upgraded to 15-inch 50s. It's going to be maybe a long-term process or maybe a quick process, but it's going to be done. as part of their modernizations, every single one of them is going to go in for various levels of modernizations. They're going to end up having 15-inch 50s. It's going to actually be a factor to modernize them maybe earlier. And you're going to want that done well before any sort of risk of war or scenario comes in. So the thing is, you're going to change your refit pattern, which means you're going to refit your ships a lot more quickly. Okay. Alright, what does that change? What am I doing while refitting them? Well, the R-Class, I'm probably just refitting their guns and making them so they can take the 15-inch 50s. But there again, I'm going to have to upgrade their optics and their fire control systems to deal with the range of the 15-inch 50s, so that'll have to be done. So while I'm doing that, I'm going to upgrade some of their bridge facilities and some of their command and control facilities. Might have to do some superstructure work. Okay. And might do some work on their secondaries in terms of air defense, so might change them to 4.5-inch guns. Okay, so I'm doing that. I'm going to probably do that on the Queen Elizabeth class at the same time. And, oh, well, I'm going to probably work on Hood, Repulse, and Renown. And some of them are going to have full massive refits, like Warspite, Queen Elizabeth, Valiant, and Renown do historically. But all of them are going to get various levels of refit, which are going to be different. And then when I get to the King George V, do I put in 14-inch guns, or do I go with 15-inch guns? Well, everyone else has got 15-inch 50s. Why? If I'm in a scenario where I've got 16-inch and 15-inch, 14-inch can be sort of more justified. But if everyone else has got 15-inch, why am I going for something else? And also, politically, why am I pushing for 14-inch when my ships all have 15-inch? Why am I putting myself through that effort for an inch? Doesn't make any sense. Make the case for 15-inch and go with 15-inch. We should all standardize on 15-inch. And so the King George V's have 9 15-inch guns. Probably. Probably they go with 9 15-inch and 3 triple turrets. They might go with quadruples, 3 quadruples, but I doubt it. I doubt they'd go with that because of weight and various other things. So instead of 10 14-inch guns, you'd have 9 15-inch guns. You might go with 10 15-inch guns, but either way, you're probably going to have an easier time with a gun you've been using and a system which is basically an evolution of a system you've been using for pretty much 20 years by this point, than a whole new system, which is going to change their operating capabilities. Which is going to mean when you start engaging Bismarck at the Battle of Denmark Straits, you've now got probably, let's say, 9 and 8 15-inch 50s engaging. But you've also got the F3s, remember? They had 15-inch 50s, so one of them might be available. So you might not even have Hood there, because you might have one of the F3s there. In which case, Bismarck is probably snookered at the Battle of the Denmark Straits. Or even worst case scenario for the Bismarck, it's got an F3, let's call it HMS Nelson, a Hood, and a Prince of Wales there. And so and at that point, you would have 26 15-inch 50s on 3 capital ships facing off against her. That's not a good scenario for her. And they can all keep up with her. So I can go through that. But with helicopters, how does that change that scenario? Well, it changes that scenario dramatically from the get-go. Because if the helicopters have changed what's happened to Courageous and Glorious, well, A, that might mean another helicopter carrier has been involved at Taranto, which might well have freed another carrier. If another carrier is involved at Taranto, that's going to do hugely much more damage to the Italian fleet. If that's done so much more damage to the Italian fleet, because, as I said, cumulatively, if you have 3 carriers down the Mediterranean force rather than 2, Eagle gets maintained a lot more quickly. So she doesn't end up breaking. So you end up with 3 carriers at Taranto. If 3 carriers at Taranto, that's a far bigger strike package which goes in, which is going to do consequently a lot more damage to the Italian fleet. So it might actually achieve what often people believe it achieves, which is the destruction of the Italian Navy, or rather taking out as a major fighting force. That's going to have a knock-on impact for Crete, because it's not the airborne forces which take Crete, it's the amphibious forces coming down from the Italians which really overwhelm the island's defences. They've just about managed to deal with the Crete, but that's a whole different scenario on the helicopter scenario, because they could be landing by helicopters, which is going to change things dramatically again. But there again, helicopters, do you want to be launching out unsupported helicopter attack into enemy fighters? You probably don't. And the whole thing with helicopters is it makes it so much more complicated to work out, because it changed the whole of the war. Pearl Harbor and any submarine helicopter patrols could give more time for aircraft and gunners to get ready. Yes, because the ASW patrols could be out, with the helicopters could be out at dawn. They could spot the attacks coming in. On the flip side, if the German helicopters from the Susurros drop spotters along the field Narvik Osvosky gets to the fortress of Torvik Sound before Blucher getting there, yes and no. The trouble is, again, if you've got helicopters coming in, this is to the point I would make. If the helicopters come in at Norway, then they have a problem. Again, if you're landing troops, that kind of changes things. You're more likely to run into fire. You're more likely to be dealing with small units who are more likely to be led by officers who are more likely to be aggressive because they're younger officers. So they're going to be less likely to be waiting for necessary command and more likely to go, let's shoot. Or you're going to run into reservist officers, which are going to be more likely to shoot. And as I said before, destroyers, even Zusseldorers, are unlikely to be carrying helicopters. Again, you've got to deal with the treaty limitations, and even the Germans don't want to break the treaties. Or in an obvious way break the treaties. And when you consider the guns they're already carrying, the top weight they already have from that, also carrying helicopters as well, they're going to not be able to carry torpedoes. They have enough issues with their Zostara designs that they're not going to go for helicopters as well. So I have a real reason when I say I don't think you have helicopters aboard destroyers. But, there again, the Germans might invest in some sloops or some helicopter carriers, and they might have them along for Narvik, and that changes things again. It's all complex, but also there's the fact that if you consider, if you've got those anti-submarine, if you've got those helicopters about, the British might be more comfortable posturing their naval forces out along the Norwegian coast and waiting for them, in which case the Germans might run into them before they even get to Narvik. It's endless permutations. And we haven't even got into what Bismarck might look like. I have a feeling, though, the Germans, because of the experience of World War I and the legacy of it, I have a feeling they're stuck in that sort of scenario a bit. Yeah, search and rescue helicopters can be scrambled. Oh my cousin, I love how Dr. Clarke's accent changes when he gets excited in the middle of making points. Yeah, it does. My students are used to that to an extent, I have to say it. One of the... I did love one of the students... I had some feedback recently from some of the students I go and teach, because whilst my main, in terms of number of hours, job has gone, I still have others going and teaching universities, and I'm always happy, any university watching, if you need a guest lecturer to come in and talk naval history or maritime law or all sorts of things, that's what I do. International relations, always happy. One of them said, "You really don't do the monotone, do you?" I went, "No. It's good, because we can never go to sleep. We never go to sleep in your class. We can't get comfortable. Thank you." Toronto, helicopters could free up flare swordfish to carry munitions. Said, yeah, but if you consider again the difference between the Whirlwind has a range of 290 nautical miles. The swordfish has a range of 454 nautical miles, carrying a torpedo. You're going to have to get a lot closer to get in range for the Whirlwind to be carrying your flares. So that's unlikely to happen. And the battle creep would be very different with helicopter air mobility, yeah. Especially as one side would have fighters and a fighter airbase, fighters domestically sport it, the other ones would have to bring the fighters in to sport it. And one side wouldn't. BlackburnMaximus, ocean liners might have helicopter mail carriers instead of amphibious mail plane carriers. Yep. It's a whole lot of potential interesting history. It's a very potentially different thing. Now, what I am going to say this evening is I am going to do this Discord for a bit. I'm going to have a little bit of a break and then I'm going to be on Discord. I'm going to do about an hour on Discord, I have to admit. And I'll be in the general chat, in the open chat channel, the general one, to chat with everyone. and talk to everyone and probably answer some questions about the contest. Again, I'm very pleased with the amount of people being interested, and I'm going to answer all the remainder questions on here, but I just thought I'd put that announcement in so that you know where I'm going to be. Helicopter battle at Cape Matapan. Well, again, that's another interesting thing. If the helicopters are at Cape Matapan, if there are other aircraft up and operating in helicopters at Cape Matapan, all sorts of things might happen. There are all sorts of problems for various forces. But as said, Cape Matapan might not happen. Cape Matapan really might not happen because the moment you add helicopters into the scenario, A, Courageous might not get sunk. It's a possibility. B, Royal Oak might not get sunk. And then you've got the compounding things build up, which mean that it's unlikely Glorious ends up getting sunk. At which point you've got at least more carriers for that for the thing at down end at Taranto, which is going to affect the Italian operations. But also, the odds are you're going to have more carriers available for the North Atlantic. So you might end up with, even under that scenario, even if the ships have all stayed the same and there's been the same stupid orders delivered in terms of pausing ships, you might end up with Courageous with, I don't know, it might be even Victorious, or Courageous could be with Hood and Prince of Wales. Now think of that, if they have a carrier with them, think about the difference in the scenario if there's an aircraft carrier with Hood and Prince of Wales. For starters, they're going to have aerial reconnaissance going up and spotting where the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen is, which is probably going to tell them the formation of the Bismarck and Prinz Eugen because it's going to watch them closely enough. Secondly, that's going to basically allow Holland to change its position and plan its attack even more with a lot more detail. Secondly, they're probably going to be launching strikes. There is the very real scenario that Bismarck and Prinz Eugen end up joining the battle already having been damaged. We know Swordfish torpedo bombers can do it to Bismarck because they do it. Guidance system of the Frix X. Put it in a 15 to 16 inch shell. Base flare would stay a minute delay post firing, and guidance services of some sort. Fold out wings and a spotter control in a heli down range to pick up the incoming shell and guide the target. Maybe, but it's a potential. I think they replace glider assaults almost entirely, Steve Clarke. I wouldn't be surprised if helicopters replace glider assaults almost entirely. Maybe gliders are still used for putting in heavy sort of vehicles, but I think helicopters replace all the infantry insertions to large extent. Which you can change your D-Day landing force, because you're not going to be able to launch the helicopters from the other side of the channel. You've theoretically got that range, but not really practically got that range. So you're going to have a load of helicopter carriers and troop track carriers, which is going to produce an LPH earlier than it did historically. You're going to have landing platform helicopters in World War II. And think about how that changes things. Think about how that affects Korea. Think about how that affects Suez. They use them actually there historically. But by that point, you'd be talking about them being a very, very core understood part of the doctrine. Helicopters have a massive difference. Does the Royal Navy Helo Force strengthen the fleet arms hand when fighting? Well, honestly, if the Royal Navy's got its own, if the helicopters are all part of the Royal Navy from the get-go, which they could be, then the Royal Navy's ordering their own engines, so they're not even having to order them through the Air Ministry; they're ordering them themselves. So remember, historically, the Royal Navy's the ones who order the 2,000 horsepower engines. They're the ones who order them because they need them, not the Air Ministry. So the thing is, it's going to be a very different scenario, because the Royal Navy could be ordering engines going, oh, they're for our helicopters. Yeah. And I'm a monkey's uncle. Sorry, just getting a message from my phone. I should respond that. Sorry. My sister's just sending me all sorts of messages. Lovely sisters. They suddenly send me messages going, what are you doing? And this also gets going. BlackburnMaximus, Draconred. The problem with guidance in a 16-inch shell is service initial G-force and a duration of acceleration. I know it was a problem with early 155 tube artillery until they came with the ERP and base bleed types. Yeah, and I do agree with that. But also, the thing is that's taking one reason that's taking place when it's taking is that's because when it's needed. And again, I'm not sure. You have some very smart people, and if they may work it out, they may not. As I said, I think it's probably too early for anything, but there's a possibility it does. And BlackburnMaximus. Allies would probably advance much further at D-Day, and Market Garden could be successful. Maybe the Allies reach Berlin first? It could be interesting. Helicopters could seriously affect a maneuver, especially as they can put troops down in positions to secure it. And again, your reconnaissance viability, your ability to spot things going on and to insert personnel, and to put them both sides of a river or sort of those sort of crossings, these things can all add up. I'm not sure how much quicker they make it, because the main thing that slows down Market Garden is the progress of the armor divisions. That's what makes it the problem it is. And there's reality, there's geographical as well as opposition reasons for those issues, but it would certainly have an impact on it. Runon, oh no, this engine just magically a drop-in conversion for a most underpowered fixed-wing aircraft. Whatever shall we do to repay this kind of twist of fate? Yeah, let's be honest, we're talking about the Royal Navy, which built the honestly a forward aviation support ship, not a carrier. Another message. I have WhatsApp on my computer so that it flashes up, so I can have the phone on silent, but I have WhatsApps in case they send me a mess. In case they send me a emergency things, I have sort of like that portion of my screen is divided. Well, I have my screens, and I have the main screen, which is OBS in or half it, and then to this side of it, it has the screen divided into two with WhatsApp beneath it, and live streaming and all sorts of details in front of that, and various things flick onto there. And then I have my notes and the chat on the other screen. So, you know, I have it all divided up so I can work and deal with things, and also check in case my mom has any questions or any issues come up. Because I will always remember getting the message, I've fallen out my chair and I can't get up. Which was mildly annoying for my mum, because it came through while I was literally on live talking to you all. I ended up having to run off inside.
Because what happens is she has a chair which does... I don't think if I told you all this. Which has sort of all the things to give her a nice comfortable back and seat. It's a proper relaxing reclining sort of chair. She thought she'd locked it in a position. She hadn't. She moved forward to get off it. It moved. She fell down, and then its position and her position meant she couldn't get up. So I had to come and move chair and then help her get up because she was just not feeling like getting up at that point. So I always have that live just in case she has issues. Yeah, escort carriers could be used as a basis for the LPHs, but there's one of your troubles for that is having the troop storage on them. So I can see where you're going with that, Peter Dawson, but the fact is you're going to have facilities to store troops, etc. So you're going to have to adapt those LPHs to an extent. Because, again, they're going to be at sea for a bit longer. They're going to be used, and they'll probably be used in torch and all sorts of things they'll be used in. So, yeah, you're probably going to... I can see where you're coming from going, oh, we'll just use an escort carrier, but there is actual difference in converting a vessel to an amphibious transport than just having it being a different type of aircraft carrier, because you have to then accommodate the Marines. You end up with... Okay, for want of a better phraseology... When you're on an aircraft carrier, you have the ship's crew and you have the air group's personnel. So you have two bodies of personnel that have to cohabit and you have to sustain a support. An amphibious ship that's using aviation has to have the air group personnel, the ship's personnel, and the landing force detachment, the Marines or whichever force they're from. And they all have their own requirements and stores requirements. You need weapons. The landing force needs someplace to store their weapons, and it needs to be secure and safe because you don't want them just wandering around. You don't want grenades left to roll around the hallways. It becomes problematic. So, whilst any aircraft carrier can do pretty much, or anything that's fitted up as an aircraft carrier can do any of the aviation roles. You can fit it to a strike system or things with minimal adaptation because you've got the crew facilities there. The moment you're taking on amphibious roles, you then have to fit in something more. So yes, escort carriers might well be used as duties, although hulls based on escort carriers, but they're probably adapted. It's not millions of Nazis. It's not millions, Frank Bamwell. There's a lot, but there's not millions. Andrew Marshall. I believe the USN used escort carriers LPHs for a bit in the 50s. Then a couple of Essex class, all led to DA Jumas. Yes, they did. But they adapted them all to support the landing forces, and so you don't just have... It's not just we're using an escort carrier, we've made it into an LPH, landing platform helicopter. Because you have to do modifications to it to support landing force. Righto. That's good. It becomes problematic. Read. Junior Seamsmith takes a break from cleaning the bilges with his toothbrush for yet another infraction and wonders what the earring on the little green ball is. Yeah, there's always some interesting people. It's very rare you get them quite that interesting, but there's always someone who's going to have more inquisitiveness than is good for their own survival. Yeah, right. So, thank you very much everyone for watching. I'm going to, as said, go for a quick break now, and I'll be back on Discord shortly. BlackburnMaximus need to have helicopters equipped with speakers to play some music. Yeah, don't be surprised. Let's be honest, if you consider all the thing we do to create the various funnies for D-Day, goodness knows what we do with helicopters. So thank you, BlackburnMaximus, thank you, Andrew Musher, thank you, Drakenred, thank you, Runon, thank you, Leslie Mitchell, thank you, Dope Squad, thank you, Frank Baumwell, thank you, Carl Van Gasberg, thank you, Richards. This is the trouble with Coke. It really doesn't work as well with me as Iron Brew does. Thank you, Marley1640. Thank you, Steve Clarke. Thank you, Just Funk. Thank you, Peter Dawson. Thank you, BlackburnMaximus. Thank you, Night68 for one. Thank you. It's when you see all these lovely chats. This chat has been lovely this evening. Thank you, New IQB4472. Thank you, George Newman. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Steve Clarke. I might have said it already, but I'll say it again. Thank you, Chris Shea. Thank you, Darius Radsky. Thank you, everyone who's been chatting away. Thank you, everyone who's all been online. Thank you, everyone who's been chatting away. Thank you, Jim David Smith. Thank you to everyone, basically, and I hope you enjoyed. And thank you, Steve Rutherford. I hope you all had a fun time. I hope you all found it interesting. The long patrol for this will come out on Saturday. I am changing around and haven't yet got a final recording for tomorrow's key ship, so who knows what that's going to be, because I'm deciding that tomorrow morning. And thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed.